Now, all right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Julian Ennis. I'm a utilities engineer with the Grid Resiliency and Microgrids team in Energy Division, and you have joined the Resiliency Standards Metrics Workshop with Lumen Energy Strategy and the Warp to Resilience, Climate Resilience and Integrated Resource Planning project. This webinar will be from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. today, September 5th, 2023. Next slide, please. Just to go over a few logistics for the webinar, the WebEx and call-in information are displayed here on the screen. You can join by computer at the link there. It will ask you to register, and you can join with the link that's given. You can also join by phone using either of the numbers on screen. However, we do recommend using computer to join or computer audio as well, because this is a bit more of an interactive webinar with breakout sessions and other features of that sorts. Just a few notes about today's webinar. The presentations will be available in the meeting invite in the link above and will be available shortly after the meeting at the link shown below. The presentations will be recorded and posted there as well. And just as a note, while one or more commissioners and their staff may be present, no decisions will be made at this meeting. Next slide, please. Just a few more WebEx logistics. Everybody that has joined the webinar as an attendee will be muted on entry by default. We will be having a few Q&A sessions interspersed throughout the presentation as well. And if you have a question to ask the group, you can use either the raise hand function or you can put your question in the Q&A. If you do raise your hand during the Q&A portion, I will be unmuting you, and you will have a couple of minutes to ask your question. And just as a courtesy to me, please lower your hand after you've asked your question. And if you have a second question, please go ahead and re-raise your hand. It helps me prioritize and list in chronological order how folks have raised their hands. You can also use the Q&A function down in the bottom right corner. There's a little box with a question mark in it. And additionally, something new with these webinars, you can also enable closed captioning on these webinars. In the bottom left corner, there's a button with CC, and you can enable closed captioning, and it will capture what we are saying. It will also be captured in the recording as well, as far as I am aware. Next slide, please. So this is just an example. If you go to the link provided in the previous slide, you can find the materials, the meeting materials, including the presentation and I believe the agenda at the link there. Next slide. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Roseanne.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Roseanne Butkevich. I'm a senior analyst on the Grid Resiliency and Microgrids team. And today we'll be featuring Lumen Energy Strategy, working through their discussion on resiliency standards. The agenda today, we will have this introduction. We'll hear some opening remarks from Commissioner Shiroma, and then I will discuss a little bit of give you a little bit of background and context to the presentation that follows. Then Lumen Energy Strategy will take over, and they'll be discussing the relevance of IRP as a case study in discussing these resiliency standards. And in this session, we'll be discussing the metrics of resiliency. We'll talk a little bit about, we'll review some of the resilience definition work that we did, that we discussed in Lumen's last presentation, and then do a small breakout session looking at in that discussion. They'll talk a little bit about how to translate the resilience definition into metrics and how to model that framework. We'll take a quick lunch break and then come back and do a little bit more deeper dive into how to bring these metrics into our modeling framework. And we'll be doing that by going into some longer breakout sessions and hopefully having some robust conversations there. We'll bring it back to the main room where Lumen will talk about refining that resilience with risk profiles. And then Commissioner Shiroma will close the session out. I'll then give a brief discussion of just a showcase of what's to come in terms of our upcoming workshops after that. I turn it now over to Commissioner Shiroma.
Thank you, Roseanne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Genevieve Sharoma. My pronouns are she, her. Welcome to today's workshop discussing metrics and standards for measuring the impact of resiliency needs as part of the Commission's Integrated Resource Planning process. The IRP, for short, we have a lot of acronyms, but the IRP makes for a good case study because it's an umbrella planning proceeding, considering all of the Commission's electric procurement policies and programs towards ensuring California has a safe, reliable, and cost-effective energy supply. I'm very pleased that we will be hearing from Lumen Energy Strategy on how resiliency definitions being developed or entertained by the Commission and others might be translated into metrics that can aid in investment and optimization, in decision-making, and it's very important that we look at these metrics as they might be applied to the broader grid planning effort here at the Commission. This will help us better ensure that grid resiliency and better protect vulnerable households from the impact of grid outages. I want to thank in advance from Lumen Energy Strategy, Mariko Geronimo Aydin and Honor Aydin, and our senior regulatory analyst, Roseanne Rekovich from Energy Division. Also from our Energy Division, our utilities engineer, Julian Ennis, and supervisor, Jason Ortego. From my office, my chief of staff, Cheryl Nguyen, and advisor, Jack Chang. I'm looking forward to the presentation and to today's discussion. Thank you, and back to you, Roseanne.
Thank you, Commissioner Sharoma. To give a next slide, to give a little context, next slide. Energy Division staff has been conducting workshops aimed at diving deeper into some of the more complex aspects of this differentiation and how to apply it to policy. In the past year, we've held 5 sessions. The interruption cost estimate calculator and power outage economic tool are tools that have been developed to look at resiliency from a more top-down econometric perspective. Sandia did a deep dive on the RENCAT Resilience Node Cluster Analysis Tool and Social Burden Index, which was followed up in July by a workshop kicking off their pilot project that they're conducting in partnership with SCE. Last month, we heard the results of work done by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, funded by a DOE technical assistance grant that looked at the feasibility of applying more local hazard mitigation plan information to a data schema that could interact with some of the utility data portals for information sharing so that we can more efficiently do some long-term planning on both in a multi-jurisdictional level. In May, Lumen Energy Strategies led the first of 3 sessions looking at resiliency standards and discussed definitions thereof. Today, we'll continue that conversation looking at resiliency metrics as they relate to those definitions. Next slide, please. To put today's workshop in context of the guiding principles provided by the 4-pillar methodology, each one of these pillars, from baseline assessment to the comparative analysis of mitigation investments through the evaluation of whether those mitigation solutions have met resiliency and policy goals, depend on the basic tenets of our resiliency standards. How is resiliency being defined? What metrics are being used to articulate the definition? And how and at what scale are these metrics being applied? The presentation we're here for today is the second in a series of 3 presented by Lumen Energy Strategy on this topic. They will build off the feedback gained from their first workshop in May and discuss resiliency metrics as we might apply them in the bulk grid planning level. I'll turn it over to Mariko Geronimo Aydin and Honor Aydin at Lumen Energy Strategy.
Thank you, Roseanne. Thank you, Jason and Julian, and thank you to Commissioner Sharoma and team for hosting us today. To the audience, it's great to have you here. We have even more opportunities for you to share your thoughts live compared to last time, including polls, 2 breakout sessions, and some Q&A. So if you can, please open up your browser on the side, open up a note-taking software or get a pen and paper. At about slide 22, we'll give you a website to respond to some polling questions, and then we'll launch into a mini breakout group exercise to get warmed up. So we've split our material today into 5 parts. One is to emphasize why our IRP case study is relevant to the resilience and microgrid development. 2, we'll recap how we got to our resilience definition specific to the model we're building and its IRP context, and then the feedback we heard from you. 3, we'll show you how that resilience definition translates into our model metrics and framework. Then we'll talk about how we can use those metrics to clarify your resilience planning priorities. And finally, we'll land by describing how a stochastic approach can help with developing a clearer picture of specific resilience risks of concern and the types of resources that can help. So we've got a lot to cover and interactive pieces peppered throughout. Please do come back after lunch if you can. We've devoted a full hour to learning more from each other on how we'd compare and contrast the resilience problem in 2 adjacent communities in a resource planning context. We're sure to get some diversity of thought and good discussion out of that, so you don't want to miss it. And with that said, I'll pass it over to Owner to get us started with the motivation for the IRP case study.
Thank you, Marco. This is Owner Aiden. I'm with the Lumen Energy Strategy. Really excited to be here and hoping to have a lively discussion today. So go to the next slide, please. So just want to start with some motivations about the IRP case study, like building resilience through the IRPs. We've had that question, like, why do we need IRP for resilience? And I think the first and foremost, what I want to highlight here is that the resilience appears in the IRP statute. In the California's Public Utilities Code, the LSCs are explicitly required through the IRPs to strengthen the diversity, sustainability, and resilience of the bulk grid, as well as the distribution systems and local communities. We discussed this during our first workshop back in March. Without a clear definition of resilience and a set of metrics to evaluate resilience improvements, this requirement so far has been mostly open-ended and subject to interpretation and addressed qualitatively at the end. For example, the utility plans address this requirement by a diverse resource portfolio that supports system reliability and helping meeting the GHG emission reduction targets of the state. And in that portfolio, distributed energy storages is typically highlighted as a flexible resource that improves resilience, which is true directionally. So this is not to say the state or the entities are not investing in resilience. There are many efforts that are centered around resilience. For example, the SCHIP program is increasingly focused on equity and resilience. Utility microgrid pilots and climate adaptation work among the few really supporting increased resilience. But today, all of these efforts are largely disconnected from the IRP process overall. And the IRP process by design has the bird's eye view on system level needs. So it's in a unique position to facilitate the coordination needed to bring local perspectives and resilience into grid planning. So next slide, please. In California, we see resilience hazards affecting all parts of the grid. And Marco discussed this at length in our first workshop. So I'm not going to get into the same level of detail, but a couple of things that I want to highlight. We've seen a broad range of climate and weather-related threats stressing our grid at multiple points. For example, the heat wave of 2020 led to rotating blackouts in California, affecting hundreds of thousands of customers for several hours. And at the time, the joint agency report and the root cause analysis identified that the event as a 1 in 30-year event, looking at just based on the history, the last 30, 40 years of history. But yet 2 years later, we had a near miss event last year in September with even higher temperatures in California. So the normal based on historical standards would be very different than the normal that we would expect today and going forward. We've seen droughts as a compounding factor, limiting the availability of hydro generation in California, but more importantly, imports from the neighboring regions. Wildfires are happening more frequently and they're getting more intense. For example, in 2019, we've seen multiple day outages due to PSPS events affecting millions of customers. And in the same year, the Saddle Ridge fire, just the wildfire, severely impacted the transmission going into the LADWP system, reducing their total import capability by more than 70%. That was another near miss event that really stressed their system quite a bit. And then storms, floods, extreme smoke all led to disruptions at various parts of the grid recently. So I don't want to go into each individual type of hazard, but a couple things jump out for us here. So when we're looking at resilience for California, we must look at across the entire grid. And any resilience-related planning must consider vulnerabilities at all these failure points, going from like the fuel supply to the transmission system to the distribution system, all the way to the resources and the customers. And that means that when we come up with solutions, we need to consider how those solutions fit with the grid as a whole. A dollar spent on grid scale generation might not get you the resilient supply you're looking for when the failure point is on the distribution system. Likewise, a dollar spent on distributed resources might not get you the bulk grid services you need further upstream on the system to address failure points there. So there's an increased need for coordination. So I can go to the next slide, please. Because environmental hazards can and do impact all parts of the grid, many of the resilience mitigation measures must be closer to the customers and communities. Traditional resilience solutions like diesel generators, for example, they're used for backup power and provided only downstream benefits to customers they serve. They're used rarely, only when there are power interruptions. So as a result, the bulk grid planning does not need to know about these resources, and it can be done totally independently. But today, the resilience solutions include resources like energy storage or hybrid solar plus storage resources. And these resources are very flexible, and they can not only support the customer and community resilience, but they can also provide benefits to the bulk grid and support the state's clean energy transition. So what that means is that the bulk grid planning now needs to consider the contributions of these distributed resources. Equally importantly, they also need to consider the limitations of these resources that are tied to resilience-related services. So if a resource is available for grid at certain times, that needs to be considered, but at other times, if it's prioritized to serve the customers, that during that time, it's not a sort of resource that can be used for grid services. And that distinction is becoming increasingly important. At the local level, considering value stacking opportunities is also important when comparing alternative solutions. Because it can, first, it can reduce the net cost of providing resilience, and we'll discuss a little more later today. And by reducing the net cost, it can improve the overall economics of resilience solutions. And then across, when we compare alternatives, that it can impact the relative ranking of the solutions. So, for example, if you consider two resilience mitigation measures, one of them is a project that can only support customer resilience, but the other one can do that, but also provide grid services. Having that kind of flexibility is something that you'd want to consider when comparing and contrasting alternatives before a decision can be made. Next slide, please. So here, and this is something that we've covered in our first workshop as well. We provide a potential framework on how to integrate resilience into resource planning, and for discussion purposes only. A lot of moving pieces. What I want to highlight here is, and reiterate, is the need for a comprehensive resilience assessment, which taps into several related but currently disconnected efforts. So, for example, this assessment would bring in a resilience definition, a framework, and a set of societal metrics and tools consistent with the CPUC's resilience and microgrids efforts. It would bring in information on vulnerability profiles of the communities and some guidance on climate scenarios from various utility-led efforts, such as CAVA, climate adaptation and vulnerability assessments, REM, risk assessment mitigation phase, and wildfire mitigation plans are among the few. And then utilizing the high resolution climate projections and scenarios that are becoming available now, it would reparameterize the electric demand forecast and supply availability assumptions to reflect the major climate change impacts and extreme weather conditions, and do it in a way that's stochastic at a high spatial granularity. And at last, I would bring in the resource portfolios from the current grid planning studies and evaluate the resilience of those portfolios and compare against each other from a resilience perspective. So if you look at the outputs, and we'll discuss more later today during today's session, but the outputs would include a set of resilience impact metrics that would be consistent with the 4 pillars methodology CPUC developed under resilience microgrids efforts. And that would include some variations of loss of load metrics and statistics, including expected unserved energy. But this would be not just for the system level as a whole, but it would show details by location, type of customers affected, the type of underlying hazards, and grid failure modes. So there will be a lot of dimensions to really consider and drill into. And to inform the grid investment decisions, the outputs would need to then flow back to the grid planning studies. And the outputs can also be used to inform certain distributed energy resource policies, ER policies, and program design, where value of resilience is an important factor. Next slide, please. So for those who participated in our first workshop, you might remember that, one of the questions we asked the participants was that what they thought as the greatest barrier to effective resilience planning. And the cost came at the top of the list among, by far, I think, among the stakeholders. So I want to talk a little bit about the cost effectiveness of resilience investments. So when we evaluate the economics of resilience plans and investments, it's important to consider the level of resilience improvement, but also the net cost of achieving that amount of resilience improvement. And this can be addressed by combining some of the key features of metrics that are commonly known, like net cost of new entry, net CON, and risk span efficiency, RSE. Net CON is a commonly used metric which reflects the amount of capacity payments a resource would need to support its investment. So it's calculated as levelized cost, both capital and operating costs, net of non-capacity benefits such as energy and ancillary services. And this metric is typically shown in dollars per kilowatt month or dollars per kilowatt year. And then risk span efficiency, RSE, is used by the utilities to compare cost effectiveness of risk mitigation programs. It's based on the ratio of the risk reduction to the underlying program cost. So the next slide will illustrate how we can calculate a metric for net cost of resilience investments using similar concepts. Again, for discussion purposes, we'd love to hear your comments or any questions you might have. But here, what we sketched out is just like net cost of resilience investments would be based on cost, the levelized capital and operating costs, and it would be offset by non-resilience benefits. So unlike net con, where the offset is non-capacity benefits, the same concept is applied here, but by subtracting the non-resilience benefits. So, for example, this can be from services provided to the bulk grid under blue sky conditions. It can include energy ancillary services, but also resource adequacy, capacity benefits, among other types of benefit streams that can be realized. And for a given type of hazard, not all resilience solutions necessarily reduce the risk exposure by the same amount, which is important because that creates a need to normalize this net cost metric by the degree of resilience improvement when comparing alternatives. And another moving piece that I want to note here is that capturing, and we have some examples later today, capturing grid benefits to offset the net cost might require some changes to operating priorities at certain times and create some additional constraints that might reduce the amount of resilience improvements. So there's kind of a feedback loop here, and we'll show an example highlighting this trade-off later. A key challenge here is that the resilience is multidimensional. It depends on characteristics of the outages. It also depends on types of customers and communities impacted. And we'll drill into this more later in our workshop and discuss how to prioritize in a way that makes the problem more manageable and hopefully actionable. So with that, I'll pause and pass it back to Michael.
Did anyone have any questions or comments on that so far?
I see a raised hand from Elijah Devon. Elijah, I'm going to request to unmute. Please go ahead, and please also remember to state your name and your organization before your question, just so we know who this is. Elijah, it appears you're unmuted, but I'm not hearing anything. Perhaps you can try muting again, and I can send a request to unmute. While that's happening, I do see a question in the Q&A from Ben Schwartz. I'll read it out loud and allow Marcon owner to answer verbally. The question is, what is needed to value IRP level resilience locally on the distribution grid? Would this be the same process the IOU used to deaggregate the IPER?
I'm not sure like the process to deaggregate the IPER, that is not clear. Then maybe maybe just clarify the question.
I see Ben has raised his hand, so Ben, I'm gonna send you a request to unmute. Again, please state your name and your organization.
Can anyone hear me? Okay, looks like I'm getting yeses. Ben Schwartz from the Clean Coalition. First, I just want to say I really appreciate this presentation so far. It seems like a really comprehensive framework in terms of valuing resilience for the bulk system. What I'm wondering is what it looks like for distribution level customers and how we can ensure that those resilience price signals are accurately forecasted to distribution customers. And just the reference to the IPER is that, the IPER is a top-down forecast that the utilities deaggregate is the wrong word, disaggregate, I believe, to local circuits and local customers. And, when the Clean Coalition or other organizations typically thinks about resilience, it's been from a bottom-up forecast to really get to the needs of distribution level customers. So what I'm trying to ask is, how can we make sure that in a resilience framework like this, that the needs of those distribution level customers are met?
I see. Good question. So that I think in some way it overlaps a lot more heavily with our next workshop, where we'll talk about some of the methodologies. Process-wise, we see the resilience as a local issue. So it has to be analyzed at that local level. Taking into account, and we'll have some more discussion later on, communities' needs and at the distribution level or at the community level, their needs and risk preferences in some ways. The link to the IRP is that when you look at the portfolio as a whole, and in your portfolio you have a mix of resources that are grid scale and partly distributed, and they can have different pros and cons when you compare against each other, both from a cost perspective and also from a value perspective. It's actually, I'm thinking more, it has to be aggregated to the IRP level. When the IRP level, portfolio level resilience is assessed, that you can see a full picture of how you meet the grid level needs, like the reliability, the GHG emission reductions, but what's also happening to the resilience at the as a whole. So I mean, I don't know if so I think the key part of that, and we'll probably discuss later in our next workshop, is that within the IRP process, how can that be integrated in a way that reflects the needs of the distribution related resilience, which might, I think a point that I made earlier, that it might create some additional constraints for some of the distributed resources that might be providing grid services. So for example, if at the distribution level, you need some resources for, say, September, October, November for certain types of risk, and you really in those months you dedicate those resources for your resilience needs at the distribution level, the capacity of those resources may need to be adjusted or even set to zero from a grid needs assessment at the IRP portfolio analysis level. So I think that interaction is really important. It doesn't mean that the resources are unavailable completely, but its availability is not at the same level as a grid scale resource that has a must-offer requirement in participating for the grid needs around the clock. I don't know if that necessarily answered, but
yeah, could I jump in with something too, Ben? So eventually we're going with this presentation. The next presentation is to support opening up the information flow between IRP and more local resilience planning. So one of our goals is to create that link or open up that link and then send back to the IRP better information about when and how distributed resources can offer grid level services instead of relying on the more static profile of distributed resources that's been used so far in bulk grid level planning. And so we think that can help a lot with getting at what you're asking about. And then Elijah, I see your note in there. I'm sorry about the audio dropout. So we haven't looked specifically at the new cost benefit ratio for RSE. We've lifted more just the concept of RSE in terms of, for every dollar spent, how much do you reduce your risk? And we think that concept generally is a great one and something we're trying to layer into what we're doing. But with that, let me continue. Oh, did you want to say something, Julian?
Yeah, I just for folks who don't have access to the Q&A, I just wanted to read Elijah's question out just so they have some context for the answer. The question was whether Lumen had looked at the update to the risk spend efficiency, the cost benefit ratio from phase 2 of the CPUC's risk order instituting rulemaking, the risk-spend efficiency was dropped in favor of much more defined safety, reliability, and financial parameters for calculating consequence and mitigation. So just wanted to give folks listening just that little bit of context.
Thank you, Julian. And then Pat Saxton had a clarifying question, which I think we should clear up before I continue. May I read that, or would you like to read? Okay. Pat Saxton says, when you say bulk grid, what specific electric system elements do you mean? I'm assuming something broader than the NERC definition of bulk electric system, all transmission elements operated at 100 kV or higher, and real power and reactive power resources connected at 100 kV or higher. Thank you for that question, Pat. When we say bulk grid, we use it a little more loosely than that. We're usually referring to more of the market concept of participating in the connected to and participating to the CAISO marketplace as a single resource. Or you could be a distributed resource and sort of aggregated through into the markets and participating at the bulk grid level. That's usually what we mean. But so if you don't mind, I'll continue with the presentation. I see one more question came in. We'll make sure that we get to that soon. Okay, so in our March workshop, this is one place we landed. Owner talked through this a little bit. And to get here, we discussed different resilience definitions used in the industry. We discussed themes and key components for those definitions that point to best practices in resilience planning. We showed you different types of resilience hazards, grid failure points, how those translate into the timing and severity of customer outages. And then we identified resilience as the ability to serve electricity to the end use customer, but recognizing that not all kilowatt hours on outage are equally impactful. And we see the system that provides that service as the electricity grid as a whole, across all grid domains, going from fuel supply to the end use customer. And we know that key hazards to that system, they include what Owner showed: extreme temperatures, drought, wildfire, storms, winds, floods, and smoke. And then the failure points and combinations of hazards and failure points of greatest concern include, but they may not be limited to, extreme temperatures and wildfires that increase demand, decrease generation, drive wires outages or derates, and these conditions that result in the system's inability to serve electricity to customers. So this defines the scope of what our resilience model needs to cover for our IRP case study. But first, I want to talk more about how the audience at the time reacted to this definition and what you all think about a resilience definition. So in March, we asked the audience a series of questions to gauge how much they agreed with where we landed on this resilience definition. A large share of the polling participants, which included 40 to 45 people, depending on the question, agree with our conclusions that what really matters here is service interruptions to the end use customers, and that not all interruptions are equally impactful. Two responses did surprise us at first, but then they made more sense once we fully digested the results. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. Almost half of the audience disagreed with our statement that failure points across all grid domains have the potential to result in high impact outages. And we interpreted this to mean that there's disagreement more on what the phrase high impact means. And we have a brainstorming session after lunch to really dig into that. Almost 40% of the audience disagreed with our statement that the key known set of resilience hazards at the state grid planning level is weather, environmental variabilities, trends, and extremes. And then the audience gave us this word cloud of other hazards that should be considered right here. The word cloud included 51 unique responses, some of them single words, but most of them strings of words or phrases. And we reviewed and discussed the responses carefully, and we categorized them by hazard theme, which you see in the donut chart. So I'll go through these categories a bit out of order in the donut chart. but a few categories we felt referred to situations that would or could at least partially be captured in our work. One of them is market and planning failures. They were part of 19% of the word cloud responses, and that would include things like market manipulation, population growth, or excess demand that hasn't been planned for. While our study does not delve into wholesale market design, generator performance incentives, market monitoring, it does attempt to help to fill in grid planning blind spots and refine our understanding of how much, where, when, and what type of resources need to be retained or developed to improve the resilience of electricity supply. Equipment and technology failures, including random equipment and facility outages, and shown here as another 11% of responses, would be incorporated in our stochastic model, and we'll talk about the stochastic element of our model at the very end of this presentation. Supply chain issues, which we've seen plenty of in the past few years with batteries, transformers, solar, it's certainly a risk to resource adequacy. In our model, these could be modeled as hazards by representing them as uncontrollable delays in planned resource online dates. But a few categories we felt just wouldn't be well reflected in our model, and we want to ask you about that. So that would include physical and cybersecurity, earthquake and tsunami, major societal disturbances like war, civil unrest, pandemics, other large-scale disasters like asteroid impacts, and we even had a response that mentioned volcanoes. I want to emphasize that these are real hazards to our ability to access critical services for survival. They're not to be dismissed, but just not well represented, we think, through the grid planning models that we're talking about. And so we want to ask you more about that. So open up your browser. We have two more word clouds for you, and this one is the first one. The question is, how should physical and/or cybersecurity fit into grid planning? To respond, go to your browser, go to pollev.com/lumen999. If you're on your phone, I highly recommend you go through your browser, but you can also text Lumen 999 to the number 22333 and follow the prompts. You do only get one response, but you can put in as many words as you want in that response. And in that response, just write whatever comes to mind. It doesn't have to be a complete sentence. It can be a bunch of words that come to mind. If you want certain words to stay together, just hyphenate them. If you want to edit your response, you can change your response, but the poll won't remember what you put in there before, so you might want to copy it out. But you can say what proceeding you think it should be in, what types of models you've seen that it belongs in, at what planning level, who should do it, things like that. So feel free to put in your responses in the word cloud. And let's see what we get here. I'll give you about a minute to fill in the word cloud. Again, just put in whatever words come to mind. Apologies, we're getting some technical difficulties here. All right. Let's try this again. Physical and/or cybersecurity, where does that belong in terms of planning? If you could put in your responses. There we go. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. And this can be a proceeding, what types of models you think they belong in, who should do it, at what planning level, what do you think of when you think of physical and our cybersecurity and how we do resilience planning on that. So we've got some interesting words here. Integrated enforcement, hacking, analysis. Hi. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you for your responses. I'm going to move to the next word cloud, and that is how should non-weather disasters like earthquakes, tsunami, societal collapse, how should they fit into grid planning? And you can say what proceeding that belongs in, what types of models, at what planning level, who should do it, or anything else really that comes to mind. And how to respond is you go to pollev.com/lumen999. And if you're on your phone, you can also text Lumen 999 to the number 22333 and follow the prompts. Microgrids. Okay. So microgrids is a word that's really jumping out. It sounds like either that's where non-weather disaster planning belongs, or microgrids can help with that. If anyone had any comments on that as we go along, I'd be very curious to, oh, lots of words here. I'd be very curious to hear more. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to close the polls and talk about one more thing, and then we'll go into a mini breakout session. So for those of you who were at our last workshop, you'll remember we did do a brainstorming exercise where we listed all of the most important factors driving outage severity. Then we upvoted and downvoted everything on that list. Again, we looked through this list in detail. We discussed it a lot. We discussed different entries in it a lot. And what we did was we went through each response, and some of them were duplicative, and we sort of consolidated them. So there is if you wanted to see the details, there's a more readable version of this in our publicly posted March slide deck. But what we see here is that the types of customers or services on outage matters a lot, such as whether that's an end use customer that's providing a critical service versus a customer that's consuming a critical service, and whether or not people are able to access services through cooling centers or emergency centers. And this to us points to outage severity and prioritization by pointing directly to where you'd want an outage mitigation solution to be. This is really invaluable information for us. It's intuitive to first secure electricity at sites that provide essential services. And if you're looking at your own neighborhood, I'm sure you already know where it probably makes the most sense to put backup power or microgrid or some other resilient solution. Other high-ranking drivers of outage severity we saw from the audience include outage duration, outage footprint, and situational multipliers like concurrence with heat waves. These polling results are very helpful and eye-opening, so thank you for those. And then in a bit after our mini breakout group session, we'll show you how our resilience definition and all this information that you provided to us translates into our model architecture and output metrics. But first, we'd like to step outside of the IRP case study for a minute and hear more about what a resilience definition looks like to you. So we have a breakout group exercise in which we'll ask you to consider 2 resilience definitions and tell us what you'd keep or change in those definitions. So grab a pen and paper or your note-taking software. Roseanne and Julian will give you more details in a minute, but basically how it will go is you'll go into a breakout room, you'll discuss the 2 definitions, everyone will take a turn commenting on it. The moderator will jot that down, and then when you return to the main room, the moderator will summarize the discussion. So these are the two definitions that we would propose you react to. And what we're asking you to do is identify keywords or phrases that you think should be kept, modified, removed, added. The first definition is more qualitative, that resilience is the ability of the grid to serve customers' essential electricity needs under a variety of knowable extreme grid stressors and in the event of a system failure by meaningfully reducing the magnitude of service disruptions, extending the duration of resistance to disruptions, reducing the duration of disruptions, and or reducing the duration of recovery. And the second has a really specific threshold. Resilience is the ability to reduce division level average interruption duration index, or 80, on major event days, or mitigate those service interruptions to customers. These are both straw definitions. They're not written by the CPUC. We're not recommending them to the CPUC. They're just a starting point for this brainstorming exercise. So with this, I'll hand it over to Roseanne and Julian.
Great, thanks so much, Marco. So we are going to be starting, as Marco mentioned, our first round of breakout sessions. The breakout sessions, as attendees from your computer, you can choose to join any of the 4 breakout sessions. Unfortunately, folks on the phone don't have that option. However, I will be staying on the main room to have a discussion with folks on the phone. Just as a note, you can choose to join any breakout session you want. However, we have capped the number of attendees in each breakout session just to ensure there's an even mix of folks throughout each breakout session. So with that, I will be going ahead and starting the breakout sessions. All right, so let's see if our breakout sessions look like they are filling up. We'll keep an eye. Please do hop onto those breakout sessions if you are on your computer, just so we can make sure we have a good mix of folks. So I'll give you all a minute to continue to do that, and then we on the main room, including the folks on the phone, can all kind of hop on and talk about this definition. So give folks 1 minute, and in the meantime, I am going to share my screen. Okay, great. I think I see about 14 folks still on the main webinar, so perhaps we can go ahead and start our discussion. So I am sharing my screen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to I believe request. Well, since I'm on the main webinar, what I'm going to ask folks to do is to go ahead and to raise your hands. So just, you'll go ahead and raise your hand. I will go ahead and request that you unmute. For folks on the phone, you can raise your hand by hitting *3 on the keypad. If you get stuck on mute, please go ahead and raise your hand again, and I will go ahead and unmute you. Fantastic. And if you are in a noisy place, you may need to stay muted, and I will request unmute when you go ahead and you raise your hand. So with that, I'm sharing the moderator slide deck for the moment. So as Mariko said, these definitions are for discussion purpose only. And what we would like you to do is to identify keywords or phrases that should be kept in these definitions, or keywords or phrases that need to be modified, removed, or added. And just for the benefit of folks on the phone, I'm going to go ahead and read these definitions out again. So for the qualitative definition is this: resilience is the ability of the grid to serve customers' essential electricity needs under a variety of knowable extreme grid stressors and in the event of a system failure by meaningfully reducing the magnitude of service disruptions, extending the duration of resistance to disruptions, reducing the duration of disruptions, and or reducing the duration of recovery. And the definition with the specific thresholds added is this. Resilience is the ability to reduce division level average interruption duration index, or AIDI, on major event days, or mitigate those service interruptions to customers. So we're going to go ahead and go around the room here, and I have a 1-minute timer up on the screen. As you can see the bar will actually count down, but I just want to go around the horn, and we'll go ahead and give each person a minute, and I'm going to jot down some notes. So let's start with Larissa Dobriansky. And just remember, folks, can you please state your name and your affiliation at the top of your comment? So Larissa, I've sent a request for you to unmute. In the meantime, does folks please go ahead and raise your hands. I don't know that I can. Larissa, I can't hear you. I believe I've sent a request to unmute. Does anybody else want to chime in? And if no one does, I'm going to start calling names. Oh, I see that scared someone off the webinar. Larissa, have you been able to unmute? Okay. Let's see. I see Allison have your hand raised, and just a reminder for folks, please state your name and affiliation.
Yes, my name is Allison Hilliard here on behalf of Reimagine Power and the Microgrid Resources Coalition. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk today. So I like the definition of the second one a little bit more than the qualitative one, mainly because it defines resilience as the ability to reduce division level average interruption duration indexes versus resilience is the ability of the grid to serve customers. I think that resilience should be defined as the ability to reduce and serve.
I think I finally found it. Sorry, this Larissa.
Oh, no worries, Lisa. Can I ask you to
I'll
hold your comment
wait.
until
I'll
Allison?
wait, but I just wanted to tell you this is a totally different system. I didn't understand how to get in the breakout sessions. So anyway, I'm available when you're ready for me.
Okay, thank you, Larissa. Allison, sorry about that. Go ahead.
No worries, Larissa. I actually couldn't figure it out either. So at least we get to chat in this one. Thank you, Julian, for giving us the opportunity here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I just think that the definition for the qualitative one should the grid is definitely something that is important, but I think we also can utilize microgrids and other distributed energy resources to provide resilience for customers throughout the state that when the grid is down, we can still have resilience through local distributed energy resources. So I think it could be a tweak right there in the beginning where it discusses the ability of the grid versus the ability to provide energy and services for customers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison, for that. Larissa, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for your patience. Yeah, this is just set up differently. To be honest, I don't look at this as like an either or. I think both are valuable because I think the broad qualitative is important to see really kind of the coverage here and to differentiate, like here, the resilience from a reliability definition. And it has, to me, all of the elements that are needed. But then the second, I actually don't look at this so much as a definition, as a metric to be developed. and that one that could, like you said, enable quantification under the circumstances, to which you apply this metric. I think a metric is needed, and this to me is not so much, as I said, a definition as it is the development of a metric.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that comment.
I don't know, should I touch anything or, should I just
Um,
keep open here? I'll just keep open, right?
Okay, yeah, that's totally fine. I'm not seeing any more raised hands, so I'm gonna start calling names because I want to hear what you all think about this definition. So our first name called is going to be Jeremy. Jeremy, you've been requested to unmute. Go ahead. Any luck? Any luck with that? Or am I scaring people off? Scaring people off by calling names. Nope, I scared people off. Okay, how about Malcolm Anspan? I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you. Does anybody else want to add to this definition? I know there's folks, we've had a couple of really thoughtful and good comments, but we want to hear more about what your perspective is on these particular definitions. And please don't be shy. The more participation we get, the better we can sort of do to refine these definitions to hopefully work on this. So in the spirit of being voluntold, Paul McCabe, I'm going to request you unmute. Go ahead. Okay. See, we're still losing folks. Larissa or Allison, do you want to add anything to what you said while we, hopefully wait for someone else to go ahead and participate?
Yeah, I'll add something. I guess, like I said, I really, in terms of my experience in the area, again, I think both are needed because, again, the second one to me would require developing the metric. This is like a metric for resilience, like SAVE. SAVE would be for reliability, but in terms of how and when to apply it, I think the qualitative definition there, elaborates and could even, help shape the development of the metric that's in the second.
Fantastic, thank you. And Larissa, just real quick, what is your organizational affiliation, just so I know?
Oh, General Microgrids.
Thank you. Okay, anybody? Bueller?
Because isn't
Bueller?
the second as a methodology, really, wouldn't you say? I mean, you
Uh,
would have
yeah,
to.
I could certainly
develop.
see that. I
The
could certainly
first
see the
one
logic in that.
is really laying out the circumstances under which you'd address resilience, and particularly distinctive again from reliability circumstances, what a reliability definition is.
Yeah, totally. That's a very good point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I know we've certainly had a lot of discussions about sort of the difference in the balance between reliability and resilience. Anybody else? Anybody else? Let's see. I'm going to continue to call on people in hopes that someone will give me something. Alana Webre, go ahead. I'm going to request that you unmute.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm really interested in the qualitative definition we have. And something that I'm interested is also how we're going to be talking about how we measure maybe whether or not communities have access to resilience in like an equitable manner, whether or not we'll be target of like what types of communities will we be targeting, or is it kind of a universal and I'm wondering kind of whether or not we would be adding more detail on what types of communities we are going to be addressing or maybe prioritizing in the qualitative definition.
Thanks for that. Sorry, I'm feverishly typing notes because I'm gonna have to share this out in the session. Just maybe I can speak to that a little bit. Is in terms of what we're attempting to do with sort of this whole resilience effort and workshop series. We've looked a little bit at the RenCat tool to sort of understand where vulnerabilities are, and we've had a workshop with Sandia National Labs, who's running a partnership with SoCal Edison to sort of work on that definition a little bit. So but definitely point taken. We really do want to make sure that that the equity piece of the puzzle is really well looked at, within these definitions and within, how we're thinking about the prioritization of how we build. And in fact, too, I think we're gonna explore that a little bit in the longer breakout session this afternoon when we talk a little bit more in detail about sort of the trade-offs and the like of what of building potentially resilient resources. So really appreciate that comment, and I definitely think that's an important one to think about. Alana, real quick, I'm going to request you unmute again. Can you remind me of your affiliation for my notes?
Yeah, I'm from the California Energy Commission.
Excellent.
All right, thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your comment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think we still have a few minutes left to run with this. So I'm gonna just keep calling on folks. Diane Artal, go ahead. You're unmuted, and just as a reminder, please go ahead and state your organization. Okay. I'm not hearing anything, so we'll keep going down the list. Erica Dahl.
And as my colleague at Scale Microgrids, I'm the new head of policy for Scale, and we are members of the Microgrid Resources Coalition. So I appreciate Allison's comments. Resilience being valued appropriately is a huge tenet of what we're trying to do with our work in California. Since I'm new, I haven't had the benefit of the other workshops that you've had on this issue, but I know there's been a lot of discussion. I see value in both of the statements, and I'm looking forward to being able to participate as these discussions go on and get some more concrete comments as I learn more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing
Uh,
that.
Julian, could I ask you a question?
Sure, absolutely.
The one thing that I guess I would raise about the qualitative, you ask what might be added. One question I would have is, does it adequately, cover sort of the three stages in terms of emergency preparation, preparedness, response, and restoration. The first stage, I'm not sure if the wording would necessarily encompass it as explicitly as the wording does for the others stages, response and restoration. So that would be maybe some additional wording might be needed to clarify the emergency preparedness stage. I could see how it could relate to some of the wording, but the wording may not go far enough to really cover that stage and its importance in terms of the qualitative definition.
Yeah, absolutely appreciate that comment. Do you have any specific language that you think would potentially help to to clarify this?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, but it is the planning and projecting out what you anticipate and how you're going to deal with it.
Okay.
It's interlinked with the others to reduce the magnitude, the resistance, et cetera, but also I think in the planning too, you have to explicitly look at your requirements, identify the critical facilities, critical services. I'm not sure here. I'm just trying to think about what might be missing here. And by the wording, that part isn't as explicit as, like I said, the response and restoration are. So that's I'd have to think about it more in terms of, precise wording to put in, but the planning, emergency preparedness and planning.
Great. That's a fantastic comment. Thank you so much. All right, so it looks like we are just about to end our breakout sessions. So I'm going to go ahead and, if I can figure out how to, stop sharing my screen so we can go back to the main webinar. I am also going to ask that we end the breakout sessions. Whoever's editing the session, let's go ahead and end them and bring folks back to the main webinar so we can continue to participate.
Somehow I couldn't share the slides and see the attendees and kind of manage it at the same time. So it was a little on and off.
Yeah, totally.
Some good comments.
Totally, it can be a little. I think it can certainly be a little confusing. So real quick, one of the panelists here is it says is editing the breakout sessions. So if you can just within that box, just go ahead and end the breakout sessions for now, so we can bring everybody back to the main webinar. Okay, I'm gonna go hop over to each individual breakout session and just remind folks to come back to the main webinar so we can talk.
Breakout session 1 is back.
Breakout session 2 is back.
Breakout session 3 is back too.
There we go. Thank you for whoever closed the breakout sessions, and we'll reconvene. Great, so I think we have everybody back in the main session here. So I see we have the slides up. So we're gonna go around the horn really quick for about a minute and prompt each moderator to kind of share out what they heard within their individual breakout sessions. So I'm just gonna go by order of who I see on my screen. So Jason, you're first, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so we had about 4 or 5 people in the breakout session. We had a lot of interesting observations shared. I think just trying to summarize here, a couple points about what should be striked was to strike the word knowable. There were a couple people who thought that striking knowable would give yourself a little bit more flexibility to respond to kind of a wider range of events. Obviously, the challenge is it's hard to plan for what's not knowable. But there are general things that one can do to increase the resiliency of the grid to general kind of disruptions. One recommended striking the word essential because you may be able to, there may be opportunities to create more value by with value stacking, and the point was made that it allows the investment strategy to be more attractive if you draw a bigger circle around resiliency needs that isn't confined to just what's essential. There were some general observations about the importance of distinguishing between reliability and resiliency, because we could plan for every kind of outage or disruption or every kind of scenario, but at what cost to customers, right? Because you can with reliability standards, there's a clear threshold that a utility, let's say, would have to meet. But with resiliency, if it's not clearly defined, then the sky could be the limit there. A question was asked, what's let's see, if we can have what is the difference in how these definitions are applied? So one commenter said that we have strategic directives internally to meet these definitions. This is someone at a utility district through grid planning and operations in the context of meeting reliability requirements. So what is the added value of what is exactly the incremental thing that is resilience? And so this gets to the point of just needing to distinguish and have a very clear separation between what resiliency requirements are and what reliability requirements are. And this person said that their preference would be to have resilience focused on the extreme events, not sort of like more routine sort of disruptions that are more so it could be categorized as sort of reliability disruptions, and that we would get more value out of defining resiliency in the context of extraordinary disruptions to the grid. And that summarizes it.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that out, Jason. All right, so let's move on to owner, because you are next on the screen.
Thanks, Julian. So just a couple. So yeah, I also had you had like 5 participants in the breakout session. So the general kind of comment was that some leaning towards the qualitative description and the definition, and they're kind of highlighting that it's really important to focus on the essential needs and the focus on service to the customers. One comment and potential area of improvement that's mentioned and echoed by most of the participants was a need to differentiate an average customer, and that average customer's essential need versus a customer who's more vulnerable. So kind of an additional dimension and a need for focusing on vulnerable customers being an important dimension that needs to be captured, and the environmental justice goals. In terms of, I think, the definition with the specific thresholds, I think one person mentioned that it's challenging, like which metric. Like there's so many different metrics. Like picking one metric to really kind of capture the resilience would be very difficult. So I think it would be a little premature to just kind of pick a metric to really to hone in a definition. And then I think one other comment I have in my notes is in the definition with the specific thresholds, this service interruptions. Oh no, actually no. In both of them, it would apply to both of them. Like the need for differentiating the type of interruptions. Like for example, if it's a blackout, it might be very different than a brownout type event. But that I think just summarizes kind of the comments. And if there's anything I missed, I would probably at the end of the roundtable, would invite the attendees to just add in the Q&A or maybe bring it up.
Great, thanks, Owner. Roseanne, you are up next.
Hi, yeah. So there was some discussion about really liking the idea of a quantitative threshold and potentially adding quantity of frequency. Also, maybe including some identification of needing to identify where the critical loads or vulnerable populations are in the discussion of the qualitative aspect of it. There was some discussion of that hard targets or like goals or targets would be good to identify, both in terms of metrics to measure reduction of disruption or in terms of the impacts. It seemed that there was some thought that everything after the dash and the qualitative piece of it, some thought that this was something that needed to be done and so shouldn't be in the definition of resiliency, but it was more actions to be taken in response. And there was some thought that it's because the words reducing and extending duration and magnitude are more quantitative, they might go better fit into the threshold piece of it. There was another comment that different industries might have different interpretations of like what noble grid stressors are. So we need to add some sort of identification of baselining, like what are the baselines that we're starting with that from which our impact is being measured. I think that's about it.
Great, thanks, Roseanne. And then Marco.
Thank you. So we had 5 people in my breakout room, really thoughtful comments from the group. People did like the specific definition. They felt like it was just more actionable and that's what would be needed in planning. But most people felt there was a need to have both definitions, both the qualitative and specific, because they each had their trade-offs, but they might work well together. So for qualitative, they felt that the qualitative definition better reflected the dimensions of both the resilience problem, but also the solutions and the different ways that solutions can help with the resilience problem. So reflecting the resilience trapezoid. And then there was mention of a need to really be able to, with the definition, prioritize specific customers or specific quantities of loads that are essential. As what I think Jason said, several people found like the words knowable and extreme, that they might be too limiting in that definition. Also words like stressor, it might be too subjective. So it's kind of unclear exactly what those things meant. But overall, qualitative alone felt that that was not actionable. With the specific definition, people liked going to the more granular level. There was a question of what division meant and how would you define the level at which you have the definition. Major event days, maybe that's not necessarily capturing the dimensions of resilience that you get from the qualitative definition. So like the ability to recover from events, and being able to meet essential needs on just an everyday basis.
Great, thanks, Marco. And then finally, I will go ahead and share out. We had about 10 or 11 folks within the breakout room. Although I did have to resort to the Ferris Bueller, start calling folks' names to get some comments. I think in general, folks liked that there was both a qualitative and a quantitative definition. I think one person made the comment that this is not an either or. Both definitions are sort of equally valuable, and can help better differentiate reliability from resiliency, and that we do need help, work to sort of develop these metrics a little bit more to make them actionable. One comment that I thought was really good was on the qualitative definition, is that does this sort of adequately cover the 3 stages in the resilience trapezoid? I think this person was saying that the first stage in the emergency preparedness and planning and anticipation, does this definition sort of encompass that? To sort of explicitly look at the requirements and potentially identify critical facilities and services. Another commenter made a really good point, is to say, how can we make sure this is an equitable definition? How do we include equity in this definition, and what types of communities are going to be targeted, or are we talking about a universal sort of top level thing? Are we adding more details within our qualitative definition to sort of make sure this is an equitable process? And finally, I think the last one that folks were talking about is that this is very much a grid scale definition, and how can we sort of focus this on the customers, and how can we sort of integrate the resiliency that distributed energy resources are bringing to the table within both the qualitative and quantitative definitions. And so I think that's all of the moderator comment we have. So I will go ahead and hand this back to Marco.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you for everyone for those great breakout sessions. So I'm going to segue into, earlier I promised that I would show you a look of how we're translating our resilience definition elements into elements of a resilience evaluation model. So just going back to how we're defining resilience for the IRP case study. So this is the model. Here's the flow chart of the model. And you have key data sources in dark purple. They're flowing into intermediate analyses. And the core of the model is really focusing on estimating outages at the customer level. From that, in a loop you see on the right, there's a way to use the raw outage outputs to identify the highest priority resilience situations you're worried about, and identify resource attributes needed to help in those situations. And you can see here how our resilience definition elements, they influence the model architecture. The whole thing really is centered on outages at the customer level, recognizing that not all outages are equally impactful. We have representation of both bulk grid characteristics and local distribution system characteristics, if you look at the lower left. And so grid stressors and failure points, they can be evaluated both at the bulk system level and at the more local level. And then we've got historical and future weather hazards helping us to construct stressors on both the demand and supply. Other data sources like meter data or derivations of meter data, vulnerability metrics, they help us disaggregate the outage results into the customer and community categories that we discussed that drive outage severity. So basically everything on the left side of the chart helps us to capture key failure points and hazards, and everything on the right side of the chart helps us to identify key impacts and resilience planning priorities. So we've done a lot of thinking about what that 4 pillars scorecard needs to look like in our application. We think the scorecard needs to have 2 dimensions to it. The first dimension represents outage characteristics, so outage frequency, duration, extent of outages. This is an output to the model, so it's something that we can calculate within the model and output that in a lot of detail. But we recognize that it'll be important to validate and calibrate those outputs to known outage patterns. And the second dimension represents customer characteristics, including both what we know about customers as electricity ratepayers and the characteristics of the communities they live in. Our scorecard's number 1 limitation will be driven by data availability, and this is important to remember. Everything we've talked about so far is great. We want to get the concepts right first, but when we actually have to model this for the entire state and not just one community, there are going to be some significant data challenges. So we've listed out a few data source categories that we could draw from. And I just want to mention that our goal here, as we construct the model, it's not perfection, which is unrealistic, or to try to overfill data gaps, which we think can create false precision in the model, but to pull together what we know, the best information that we have, and see what that information tells us. So let me take you to the outage impact table that we've sketched out. We've sketched this out based on the outage characteristics and the customer characteristics we've discussed, and attempting to show as much detail as we can without overwhelming people with numbers. And we think that this is realistic given data availability. So we have for outage characteristics 3 sets of categories for a total of 18 types of outages. The categories are the footprint, is it an isolated, local, or widespread outage? Duration, is it a short, multi-day, or extended outage? And then frequency, are the outages high frequency or low frequency? And then for customer characteristics, we have 3 sets of categories for a total of 8 types of customers or customer buckets. Number 1 is equity, low versus high burden customers. The sector, residential versus commercial and industrial, and then on the load or the site is if it's critical or not. The thresholds that separate these categories, we intend to make as customizable as the data allows. So for example, as you're distinguishing critical versus not, there may be different opinions on that, or what does high frequency versus low frequency outage mean? And everything in this table ultimately would be expressed in terms of kilowatt hours interrupted. So let me show you more detail on how we can use the available data to help us assemble a table like this. Yes, Commissioner Sharma.
Thank you, Monica. I sat in on one of I think it was Jason's. Well, I tried to sit in on all of the breakout sessions, but the representative from SMUD brought up: is there a blurring of reliability with resiliency, insofar as if we're talking about safety and so forth? And I served on the SMUD board for 20 years, and there's this aspect of what kind of reliability should the customers have and that they can depend upon in terms of the investments made and monitoring safety and those kinds of metrics towards reliability? That on average, outages would be repaired with a certain number of minutes, as distinguished from the catastrophic storm, the heat storm. And so as you are filling in this information, is it about setting, well, what is the baseline right now in terms of what the experience is across the state? And then layered on top of that, what what happens when there is a catastrophic event? Is that what you're outlining here?
I think that what we start seeing is so reliability typically is defined more on the system level on average for customers on average, whether you're looking at the IRP kind of loss of load expectation type metric, or if you're looking at more of a distribution focused metric like SAIDI or SAIFI. But when we dig deeper in the data, we start to see differences in communities. And one big question that comes up for us when we see something that looks like a resilience problem is this really a resilience problem, or is this a local reliability problem? And should reliability not be redefined as a whole, but should reliability be defined more on a local level than as a system-wide level? That's just a question. And I think that this type of analysis that we're going through today can help sort of unveil some of those differences and stimulate the discussion of, do we need to look at reliability more at a granular level, and then how do we untangle reliability from resilience? What's the difference there? So I apologize, I just added more questions to your question. I don't think I'm the person to answer it.
That's very helpful. No, thank you. Thank you. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Analysis. Thanks.
So thank you, Commissioner, for that comment and question. So we wanted to show you some data for a community called Sonora. I don't know why I muted myself.
Yeah, right. We didn't hear your last few sentences.
So we wanted to show you some data for Sonora, California, just to give you something more tangible. Sonora, California is a community of about 5,000 people. They're near the Sierra Nevada foothills, about 120 miles straight west of the San Francisco Bay Area. And what we did was we reviewed and processed circuit level outage data for the circuits serving Sonora for the period 2015 through 2019. And these outages, they're sustained outages on the distribution system. They do not include PSPS, but they do include major event days. And then we found from a separate data source, we layered on PSPS data for those circuits. We also saw PSPS for 2020, so we put that on there. So the 2020 data is just for PSPS. And here, what we see is this clear seasonal pattern. There's a problem in the winter. You see vegetation falling on the lines and equipment failures. In 2019, there was a really bad winter storm, and there's a problem during fire season. Even if you don't think PSPS is going to happen every year, or it's not going to happen as much in the future, this PSPS data, it's just an indicator to us of the underlying wildfire risk. So now the circuit data are down to the minute level, so we can calculate durations off of this. We can calculate frequency statistics from it. And then we also have data for more than just Sonora. We can look at other areas to get a sense of when an outage happens in a day in Sonora, how widespread is it through the rest of the system. And so here's how that breaks down. And what we're doing is we're slowly sort of populating that table. We've populated an outage table for one dimension in terms of the circuit hours per year. So it's not in kilowatt hours, it's in the circuit hours interrupted per year. And you can see the profile of the data. Sonora has several circuits with relatively high outage frequencies, and they tend to have two types of outages. One is on the left of the table, these short isolated outages, And then the other is on the right of the table, these multi-day outages when there's more of a widespread outage problem across the system. So just to be clear how we're distinguishing these categories, the footprint category, it's based on whether or not Sonora and other areas are having above average outage days in a particular day in terms of total circuit hours per day. And then the frequency category, we basically assign each individual circuit high or low frequency. So they're assigned high or low based on whether or not they have an above average number of outages compared to all other circuits on the system. And you can see in Sonora, the circuits on the right, the circuits tend to be on outage for about 60 hours per year or 2.5 to 3 days per year in this period. And I'm going to layer on one more piece of information to demonstrate how we start to get at the customer characteristics. So for each circuit, we have a total number of customers on the circuit, and we have a breakdown of customers that you see here. We have residential, medical, residential, non-medical, commercial and industrial and other. So now we can start to express these outages in terms of the different types of customers affected and in terms of customer hours. In a minute, Owner will show you these data in pie charts, so they're easier to absorb. But basically, the impacts are largely residential in terms of customer hours. But for now, take a look at the columns on the right. I said before that Sonora has a population of about 5,000 people, but we have data on 15,000 residential customers, which is a lot. These circuits that serve Sonora, they also serve other communities. So just keep that in mind as a data limitation, but this is what Sonora customers experience. And if you look at the very last column, customers, when you look in terms of customer hours, they tend to see a bit more than 3 days on outage per year on average, suggesting that the circuit outages tend to happen on the more heavily loaded circuits. So from here, I'll pass it to Owner, who will show you how we can bring community characteristics into the mix. And I'll just ask all of you in the audience if you could bring up your note-taking software or your pen and paper again and just take notes on these next 6 slides. That's going to be really important for the next breakout group exercise that we'll do. So I'll pass it over to Owner from here.
Thanks, Marika. And I think one thing that might also be helpful is the presentation, except for the poll results, it was already posted before, like on the CPUC's website. So if you miss some of the information, you can, during your lunch break, you can always pull up the presentation and go back and look at the specific slides that has this information. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so to compare and contrast, we picked a second nearby community at Twain Harte. And Sonora and Twain Harte, they're less than 10 miles apart from each other, but they have very different characteristics, both in terms of the community and the customer characteristics, but also the type of outages that they've experienced historically. And we'll go through some of these differences before we break for the group exercises after lunch. The next slide. Okay, so here this table summarizes some of the community characteristics. So if you look between the two areas, Twain Harte is less populated, so it has about 2,500 people as opposed to 5,000 people living in Sonora. And among the population, the age mix is somewhat different. Relative to Sonora, Twain Harte has fewer children under age of 10, and then more elderly population as a in percentage terms. So one thing worth highlighting is that people living in Twain Harte are more affluent overall. So Twain Harte has about 35% higher median income than Sonora, and at Twain Harte, much fewer people are in or close to poverty thresholds. And then if you look at the latest California Communities Environmental Health Screening Tool, CalEnviro 4.0, you see Sonora's score at 54 percentile as opposed to Twain Harte at 17 percentile. And what this indicates is that the people in Sonora have higher pollution exposure, and they're more vulnerable to pollutants in terms of their population and socioeconomic characteristics. And then the two areas also have very different customer profiles. That Sonora residential customers account for about 30% of the total electricity used annually, while the non-residential commercial and industrial customers account for 70%. And then if you go look at Twin Heart is a lot more residential. The mix is flipped. Residential customers use 70% of the total electricity, as opposed to non-residential customers using only 30%. And then another metric that we put in here is about the DER adoption rate. That in terms of the distributed energy resources, despite being less affluent, Sonora has a lot more behind-the-meter solar and battery systems than Twin Heart. And it's not clear exactly why the difference, but we think it could be due to the general terrain and the rooftops at Twin Heart getting potential less direct sunlight because of the trees they're on. Could also be more difficult to get interconnection for resources in Twin Heart than Sonora. But in terms of the overall installations, you kind of see that Sonora has about almost 2,000 installations for a population of 5,000 people. That's a really high adoption rate. Mostly solar, but increasingly storage systems are being added, whereas Twin Heart has much fewer systems installed. And then let's go to the next slide. So this slide compares the total circuit outages experienced by the two communities. It's basically the same charts that Marika showed for both areas. And the both areas have, if you look at it, have challenges during the fire season in the fall and also the storm season in the winter periods. And one key distinction, if you look at it closely, is the summer period. It gets buried under the noise in these charts, but if you look closely, Sonora had smaller but noticeable and persistent outage events throughout the year, including summer months. Whereas at Twin Heart, we saw much fewer outages during summer period. It was much less frequent. Another point worth highlighting is that the overall magnitude of circuit outages is higher at Sonora because there are 10 circuits there as opposed to only 2 circuits serving the customers of Twin Heart. So we get a very different picture when we normalize the outages by number of customers. So that's the next slide. Okay, so here we summarize the outages normalized by customers, and the circles in teal color show the average outage hours that the customers experienced in each month based on the outages observed that they've experienced between 2015 and 2019. We excluded 2020 because for that year we only had the PSPS outages, so we didn't have the full picture of all the outage events that are happening at the granularity that we needed. So that may understate the outage rates that you see in September, because there was a major PSPS event back in September of 2020 affecting both areas. And then going back to the charts, the gray columns show the range of outages across years and across customers connected to different circuits. The variation across being on a different circuit, serving those communities. And comparing the two areas, overall, see that the customers in Twin Heart experienced more hours of outages on average, both in winter and also during fire season in the fall. But then you see that spike in February, like if you look at Sonora, like a subset of customers in Sonora connected to certain circuits were much more heavily impacted during winter storms, especially back in February 2019, there was an extended outage event. So, even though on average the customers in Sonora may have experienced fewer and shorter outages. A subset of the customers have been affected a lot worse. Their effects and the outage experiences were order of magnitude higher in that month in winter. So I want to move to the next slide, please. So this is, here on this slide, we compare a detailed breakdown of the outages, and it's in this same format that Mariko showed earlier. So in both areas, most outages were widespread, multi-day, and they happened, multiple times, like more frequently, above average in terms of the frequency. It wasn't a single long outage, but multiple events. These are like events that are driven by storms and PSPS events, like major events. As Mariko said, there were also like, type of outages that were like isolated, and both like as short events that are like under like 12 hours, but we also saw isolated multi-day events as well, where only like some circuits were on outage, where the rest of the regions that we looked at didn't really experience as many outages. And then one key difference is when we look at on average, the Sonora customers experienced, and that's the last column here. Sonora customers experienced around 80 hours of outages per year, while Twin Heart customers experienced over 130 hours. So that's in terms of the overall magnitude. There's a difference. And if you look at the distribution across different customer types, the distribution was relatively uniform in both areas. You see in Sonora, the customers, the CNI customers, were connected to circuits that had slightly fewer outages than the average. So you see them experiencing 73 hours of outages versus 81 to 88 hours, depending on the other customer types. But I think that, yeah, those are the things that I want to highlight here. And then the next slide is really the same information, but a little more visual, just so it's a little easier to absorb the data. So when you look at this, just a couple additional things that jump out. In percentage terms, the outages were a bit more concentrated to be widespread multi-day outages in Twain Harte than in Sonora. So it's 67% versus 57%, even though the overall magnitude was higher in Sonora. And then also the share of outages by, and that goes to like some of the comments about vulnerability, the share of outages by residential medical customers was higher in Sonora, that's 9%, as opposed to the 6% in Twain Harte. Although these customers experienced, the total number of outages that they've experienced was shorter than the customers in Twain Harte. I think I'll pause here, maybe kind of look at the slide a little bit more before I think we will break for lunch. I think I'll pass it back to Mariko.
All right, thanks, Soner. So I think we're at lunch. We plan to, Julian or Roseanne, please interrupt me anytime. We plan to take a half-hour lunch break, so let's do this from 12 to 12:30 instead of 11:55 to 12:25. Would that be all right, Julian?
Yeah, I think that should be fine and should keep us relatively on schedule.
Great. And we'll leave these questions up for you to ponder. We recommend that you take a look at them, jot down your notes, and right after the lunch, we'll go right into a breakout session.
Great, thanks everybody. We'll be leaving these slides up and we'll be going off video and pausing the recording. No worries, all you.
Okay, as people trickle in, I'll get us rolling on the next breakout group exercise. So over the lunch, we asked you to consider the Sonora versus Twain Harte data that you saw and comparing and contrasting them, and asked you a few questions to ponder. What types of outages are the most concerning and why? Which community has the more severe outage problem in your mind and why? And does the analytical approach so far stay true to 4 pillars? What are its strengths and how can it be improved? We hope you took some notes on that. It will be useful for the next breakout group exercise. This one will be more in depth and we're devoting a full hour to it, start to finish. And we'll ask you to compare and contrast these two sets of outages for Sonora and Twain Harte and identify priorities for resilience investments. So we're asking you to consider the outage statistics you saw, the mix of ratepayer types, the community characteristics, how they compare and contrast. You can assume investment resources are limited and not all outages can be mitigated. And just apply your own interpretation to the data and your own risk tolerances. There's no right or wrong answer here. What's most important is the dialogue. So get your notes ready. Julian will explain more how to get into a breakout room. And once you're in a room, it's basically going to work the same way. You'll go around and provide the group your thoughts. This time, the moderator will give you additional information after that, and you'll go around the room and give your reactions to that. So from here, I'll turn it over to Julian.
Great, fantastic, Mariko. So for these particular breakout sessions, I will be starting them again soon. We will have three breakout groups, and I will be remaining again in the main room to make sure that anybody who is joined by phone has a chance to participate. So again, when I start the breakout group rooms within the attendees panel on the side of your WebEx, that's the little person icon in the bottom right corner, you should be able to click and join whichever breakout session you want. Just again, the numbers of participants within each breakout session will be capped just to make sure there's a relatively equal spread of folks attending each one. And again, I will be in the main room to pick up anybody else who doesn't join those. So without further ado, I will go ahead and start these breakout sessions. Great, fantastic. Looks like the hosts have gone ahead and joined each of the sessions. So again, for all the folks that have joined by computer, you can go ahead and join a breakout session as you please. And again, I will be remaining in the main webinar here to pick up any folks that may not be on another breakout session, including those on phone. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. Okay. So let me just do a couple of things here so I can have what I need. Okay. Fantastic. So I see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 folks. 8 folks that have remained here in the main webinar. So again, I'm just sharing my screen right here. So I will go ahead and skip straight to the questions about comparing and contrasting outages, identifying priorities for resilience investments. So based on the questions that Mariko asked you to sort of ponder over lunch, our first exercise here is we want you to sort of compare and contrast the outages and identify priorities for resilience investments. We're asking you to consider the outage statistics, the mix of ratepayer types, and community characteristics. And we have the data on the previous 2 slides. So if you'd like to see that again before sort of considering your answer, please let me know and I can skip to those slides. Just again, assume those investment resources are limited and not all outages can be mitigated, and apply your own interpretation of the data and risk tolerances. I really want to stress here we want this to be, as positive of a conversation as possible. There are no right or wrong answers to this question. So unfortunately, since we're in the main webinar, I don't have the ability to unmute Well, actually, that's a lie. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and request that all of you unmute, and then, we can go ahead and go around the circle, and take a minute each to, sort of answer the question and sort of let's talk about, how you'd approach these questions. So I'll give you all a minute to sort of gather your notes and ponder. And I see Larissa. Larissa again has come off of mute. Just a reminder to folks, please state your name and your organization, just so we know who you are speaking on behalf of. Larissa, go ahead.
I was just getting ready. I wasn't raising my hand yet. This time I wanted to get set because of all the complications last time.
Yeah,
So I'm
absolutely.
not ready. Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to get in the mode for the breakout session. That's all. So I'm
No worries.
looking at this. Sorry.
No worries. No worries. Thank you for letting me know. In the meantime, does anybody else want to go ahead and come off of mute to sort of make a comment? Do you want to see the other data slides a little bit more before making your comment? This time is your time, and we want this to be a productive discussion. And I will start calling names if you don't answer in good time.
Well, I'll say something. Then I've looked this over. Really an invaluable contribution, the importance of the data. And then, going back to our first exercise too, in the past, kind of system-oriented metrics have been used, and they are averages, whether here, the ones that have applied for reliability, and now even the kind of metric that you presented, as a second definition. But your comparison, because it's so important, like to these equity issues, and then to be able to better target, the planning, the evaluations, the modeling, and then the actions. And you've shown well, two communities and how they are different, and how you need to better adapt, your planning, response, restoration efforts. I think that's very valuable. And in my practice, like in certain regulatory venues, it has been more standard, systems oriented, and it misses these differences as a result. But with more of a focus on equity and looking also at, you mentioned a difference, moving why systems moving to the local. This is why to home in on where the troubles really lie and why, and getting that data, developing it and making these comparisons, I think will be extremely valuable. And this is not an approach. I've participated in a lot of jurisdictions, and this is not an approach that is widely used at all. In fact, still much is just, evaluated at a systems level, and the metrics are, system-wide averages. So this, I think, is extremely beneficial and can help not only, like you said here, compare and contrast, but to set priorities better that are tailored more to the circumstances, here, distribution level, the class of customers, the nature of the problems, and then that will help to shape the solutions and protect the critical facilities and essential services that are identified. So really excellent, I'm learning here, and I think excellent, what you're giving us to consider in methodologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely appreciate that comment. We are really, really trying to take this out of sort of the realm of, big high level definitions and into, these much more specific use cases. I don't see any hands up for the moment. So Larissa, perhaps you can maybe elaborate a little bit more, what kind of, what in this situation, what do you think your priorities for resilience investments would be? Is there, do you see a particular customer class you want to protect, a particular type of facility facility you want to protect, what would you potentially prioritize for
Now,
resilience
I
investments?
do have to tell you one thing. You're picking out data, but in terms of a lot of these crises, of course, in most cases where you have these major events, need to declare emergencies and get FEMA federal level help. And that help is based on criteria that go to all of the questions you've asked, okay? There are protocols in terms of emergency preparedness, response, and restoration that have been developed at the federal level and that are aligned with the states who, have to position themselves to get that kind of support. And then in the case of California, going back to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, California had the best plans and for local energy assurance planning, how from the federal to the state to the local, these protocols were brought down. So these go to your questions on how to evaluate and set up, these energy assurance, energy emergency preparedness plans for all hazards. And so they guide you as to, well, what are the threats that your particular locale needs to look at, the risks, and in terms of frequency, magnitude, and then against what are the essential services that you need in your community to be protected and the critical facilities. And of course, there's a whole array of illustrations that at the state and federal level to guide you in developing these plans to protect your facilities and to develop your risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. So each community needs to look at, like you said, its particular characteristics as to its vulnerabilities, its risks, weigh the magnitude, frequency, what are the critical facilities, essential services to be protected, and in the way you've broken out.
Larissa, I think you may have cut out. I don't hear you, and I hope that's not a function of my my headset malfunctioning. While she sorts that out, potentially, does anybody else here want to chime in on sort of, how you would prioritize your resiliency investments in, given the data that, that we've presented here, and again, I want to stress there's no wrong answers. What you say here will not be held against you in a court of law, the usual exhortations. But okay, so Lisa, I'm gonna mute you and send you a request to unmute again to see if you can do that. Uh-oh. Okay. Perhaps we can move to some folks here on the call. Dale Fontanez, do you wanna add anything? I've sent you a request to unmute. Okay, hearing nothing. Richard Coe. Richard, anything to contribute? How about Alana? Alana, would you like to contribute anything to this discussion?
Thank you so much. I think I would prefer to listen on this certain discussion. Thank you, though.
Okay. Let's see. I have someone listed as Anne. How about Benjamin? I told you I wasn't above. Told you I wasn't above calling people out. Amanda, would you like to comment on this? Again, I want to stress, you know, we're not, there are no wrong answers here. We're not, you know, we're just trying to get a general sense of how folks would sort of, you know, potentially prioritize, you know, their resilience investments just simply based on the outage data. You know, again, this is not, you know, we're not trying to, you know, create any policy objectives out of this. We just want to know sort of what your thinking is on this, and we would, you know, really appreciate anybody who wants to sort of contribute to the discussion to do so. You know, to please raise your hand and make a, you know, make a comment on that, because, you know, anything here is valuable, you know, in sort of giving us an idea of how people are thinking about this, about this topic. You know, maybe how about this? Why don't I go ahead and just sort of share briefly how I potentially would look at the data, and then, you know, potentially folks can sort of comment on that and try to poke holes in it, and, you know, maybe we can try and start a discussion that way. Okay, hearing no objections, you know, I will go ahead and skip back up to the data, you know, looking between Sonora and Twain Harte. You know, I think I, you know, believe that there's you know, a strong case to be made, you know, for sort of the equity piece of the puzzle. So, you know, folks in Sonora have a higher pollution burden. They also have, you know, a potentially sort of lower income, more folks, you know, closer to poverty. There's a high concentration of commercial and industrial customers there. So, you know, I think there's certainly, you want to, in this case, there's a balance to be achieved here, because, you know, obviously those commercial and industrial customers are big economic drivers for the area. You know, I think that's certainly an important thing, you know, for folks to be able to work and to earn money to sort of, you know, to sort of have their own ability to sort of withstand the consequences of these outages. However, you know, there's also the balance that to be made, that, you know, there's a fairly high proportion of residential medical customers within Sonora, you know, that I think should absolutely be protected from these, you know, these isolated multi-day and widespread multi-day actions, you know. So, you know, I think there's certainly a case to be made here that within Sonora, if you can, you know, if you can sort of prioritize an investment that could keep more of those, you know, more potentially of those residential medical customers, you know, I think you're sort of protecting the most vulnerable within those community. Now, you know, a question that would arise from that is, you know, potentially how are the circuits arranged, and can you sort of receive co-benefits to, you know, commercial and industrial customers, while also, you know, to protect economic output, whilst also, you know, whilst also making sure that these residential, you know, medical customers, and, you know, non-medical customers as well, can maintain, you know, power if there's outages. You know, on the flip side of that, looking at somewhere like Twain Harte, which is a little bit more affluent, but also doesn't have quite the you know, potential, you know, for solar resources, and the like, you know, and has a um fairly low percentage of commercial and industrial, you know, is you know, could a resiliency solution sort of be tailored more towards residential. Again, you know, they have a fairly, it seems like a fairly, you know, there are residential medical, you know, comprises of, you know, about 400 customers versus about 6,500. So there's sort of orders of magnitude here. But again, can we prioritize a solution, a storage solution that could sort of keep some of these more residential medical customers and protect more vulnerable folks as well. So I've talked a lot. Please, I want to hear what you think on the topic. Do you agree with sort of my way of thinking about and potentially prioritizing resilience investments? Do you disagree? Do you have a different perspective that you want to add? Am I missing something? Please raise your hand and tell me, because I'd love to make this bit more of a discussion to sort of understand what priorities are out there. And again, no wrong answers here, I promise. Anybody? Bueller? Oh well, a good number more people have joined. Apparently I hadn't refreshed my list. So maybe I'll just start calling people to sort of to chime in. So I see Nicole Collette. I'm going to request you unmute. Do you have anything to add to what I just said? Do you disagree with anything I just said? Please feel free to to talk it out. Well, seeing nobody, I'm going to request everybody. I'm going to request everybody unmute, and I'm looking for, for any sort of thoughts, on this. So you all should have requests to unmute. So please, I am. Otherwise, if no one says anything, I'm just here talking to myself.
Okay, well, I don't know how long I'll be on, Julian. I dropped off. I had technical problems. This is Larissa again. But totally agree with what you've said as to the importance of having this data to be able to even prioritize and look at the differences here. And like you said, it enables the ability to better see what your trade-offs are and to better address all your needs in terms of the vulnerable classes, but also what are their essential services. And, but against, like you said, of course, economic development viability of the community at large. So this data is valuable in making these differentiations. And again, this needs to be done. There is a bias presently just to look at things from a standards level, but not to see, where there is these disproportionate impacts, and therefore to bring better equity, to the situation. Beginning to look at this in different jurisdictions, like I am on the East Coast. So in terms of District of Columbia, they are quite concerned that certain pockets, because of where they're located, their particular circumstances, and they have the lower income classes that live there, they are much disproportionately impacted than other areas within the district. And again, too, on the California side, there is great guidance at the state level and in terms of local energy assurance plans on the methodologies here to guide the data collection to make these differentiations. And that brings to me overall greater benefits, not only in terms of addressing the threats and the risks, but bringing the value to where it is locationally most needed. That to me was the importance of what you described.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's you know, like you said, that aligns very well with where I'm going, and especially to focus these on the equity piece, I think is really important. Really important to sort of continue to
And,
think about that.
it's not just even the equity. It's that this is where the greatest impacts, occur. And to disclose that, because oftentimes there's a correlation here between where the impacts are occurring most heavily and those with the least income, least ability to actually deal with it. So there really, I have found in experiences so far, a big correlation there. So to be able to withstand the very events and the nature of them is tied to who is being impacted. And that's where also the equity comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely agree. So, to maybe take this a step further into the specific areas, the way that I, potentially laid it out, Larissa, what if anything would you change from sort of the sort of prioritization that I laid out? What would you or could you potentially change with that to sort of, to maybe better target these solutions to these communities. Let's put a parameter on this, that you can only cite one large battery system between these two towns. Can you run me through a little bit about how you might potentially prioritize that differently than I did?
The thing though is, are these commercial facilities impacted as much as the lower classes in their areas? Is there any overlap, as you said? Because in implementing here, you have to look at the critical facilities, essential services. And that might be the way to get your balance in protecting those services and facilities. Also, it may be a way to enlist the services of the C&I, the industrial, to help with the situation. They are more in a position to help themselves. Many are investing in microgrids, etc. So it is to see what is the extent of their problem, or can they or are they dealing with it themselves in an effective way, and also how can they contribute in terms of neighboring areas to those that are impacted by their operations and most vulnerable to, major events. I think looking at the players, the really disadvantaged are the ones that don't have the ability to invest themselves and will need assistance. And the industrial class C&I, they can actually be engaged to participate at not only in helping themselves, but helping others.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point, because it is true. It is true that, more and more, and especially in heavily impacted areas like this, is that C&I customers are, increasingly turning to sort of their own resilient solutions to sort of mitigate lost production. And, I think equally too, it's a little bit easier to sort of quantify what that potentially monetarily quantify what that lost load is worth, because that lost load equates to lost production, which equates to a very tangible, like, lost dollars for a CNI customer. But equally, the flip side is unfortunately true for residential, is that impacts can vary widely based on a number of socioeconomic indicators, including income, pollution burden, et cetera. And there are very strong correlations, that can be extrapolated. But I think equally there has to be, sort of the thought back and forth between the two, to kind of do this sort of prioritization. So just real quick, we are gonna move on within the breakout, because this is a great discussion. And within this breakout, I want to add another layer to it, to sort of hopefully entice folks to sort of comment, kind of let me know what you're seeing in this. But just real quick, I want to give anybody else on here just a chance to, raise your hand. Again, I'm looking for, do you agree? Do you disagree? Are we missing anything? What can you add? What can you add to this kind of prioritization, to decide where this, say, one battery installation might go, between these two communities to sort of increase resiliency. You can go ahead and raise your hand if you go to the participants icon, the little person icon in the bottom right corner. It should show your name, and you should be able to click on the little hand icon next to you to virtually raise your hand. Raise your hand if you want to talk about it. Going once, going twice. Bueller. All right. We'll go ahead and move on then, and hopefully, this next sort of talk can sort of help us to sort of sharpen this and hone this discussion a little bit better. So now we're going to add a little bit of a layer on top of this with the opportunities for grid services and the trade-offs thereof. So, based on recent market prices in the CAISO pricing area, recent RA contracts, and the avoided cost calculator for distribution deferral, you can see on the left the percentage of total project cost that could be offset by, by using this, let's say battery or solar and storage installation to do sort of system participations. However, the trade-off here is that grid services in late winter through early summer, they will produce the largest share of sort of material energy and renewable integration value. But the problem, and could also, potentially reduce the net cost of the resilience investment by up to 50%. But the problem is that grid services during either of those periods can potentially cause resilience effects. So you see, within the late summer and fall, there is this, huge spike in the ability to provide for system and reliability. However, that sort of correlates, with the beginning of sort of higher outage occurrences in these two towns around that time. So you can see that the trade-off here is that if, the more of your battery or the more that you're able to bid into these markets, the less that you'll potentially have available to, for your own resilience. So, now, knowing that, how would that sort of refine your response and, about grid service opportunities and trade-offs? So, let's say both now communities decide to build, how does the prospect of additional benefits from grid services affect your thought process of whether or how to stack services? And if you would consider offering grid services, how would you refine the resource operating profile to meet local needs, but also get the most out of grid value? What resilience or grid services sacrifices would you be willing to make or not? So we're asking the big questions now. Just a reminder, folks, please go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to add to this discussion. Otherwise, it's just a lot of me talking. And while I enjoy talking about this, I also want to hear what folks have to say. So I see Larissa, you have your hand up again, please.
Yeah, this one, there are a number of us even in your webinar today who are participating in the CPUC demand flexibility proceeding. So one thing that is reflected, it seems, in your discussion is you're looking at participating in a market that's at the power market, the bulk power service level. The question is, why can't you have a retail market that allows for participation and contributions that can be compensated along these lines? And that's what's, being addressed in the demand flexibility proceeding in California. So it may not be just, well, either you're participating and getting value in CAISO versus no value at the retail level. You can price and value and trade at the retail market. That is something that I think should be examined. That would be my comment.
Yeah, absolutely. very much appreciate that. And, again, we're looking at this as sort of an illustrative case. So again, what we're showing
And-
here, this is not the be all end all of
Yeah,
of
no,
what
I'm
we're-
just
what we're
saying
trying to
that should be examined because it's aligned with a more tailored methodology, which is what is reflected in, all that you've been discussing. And so you can't get that alignment at all when you're participating in the organized power market. That's not going to yield the benefits at the distribution level in terms of resilience, but you could set up the pricing mechanisms to be able to make these contributions and make them where they are most needed and get that trading taking place, where locationally you'll get the value and respond to the prices at the distribution level. And that actually, I'm making this comment because it is so much in alignment with your methodology.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And I think that's a fantastic point, is that, there are these other services that we can absolutely can absolutely sort of tap to sort of increase the value of these resources, sort of regardless of where they are and what the sort of level to them is. I think it's also, again, though, it's illustrative of the trade-offs, because could those sort of mitigations be potentially more pricey on top of what's already being built, and can you offset that with the participation in these markets, regardless of whether you're at the bulk level or at the distribution level that's responding to those price signals. And
See,
certainly
that
appreciate
goes to the way you calibrate and inform the pricing and the market design of your trading mechanisms.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a good number of people on here. Please feel free to pipe up. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to send everybody a request to unmute. If you'd like to contribute to the discussion, please by all means, we'd love to hear what you would potentially sort of add to this, and and how would you think about all of the about your decision to sort of stack services. So I'll give folks a minute to.
One last comment, Julian, is that
Sure.
in terms of what's going on now under FERC Order 2222, they want coordination between the wholesale transmission level and the distribution level in order to set priorities so that you're not going to be participating in the market at the organized power market end when there are resilience problems at the distribution level, that there needs to be this coordination, and that the resilience, the major events, will have the priority. So even if you make a commitment to participate in the bulk market, you will have to stop, cut down, rework to defer to the events and resilience priorities at the distribution level. So from a regulatory standpoint, this is already being addressed, and California has been the leader in trying to evolve these priorities and the coordination between the wholesale, retail, transmission versus distribution levels.
Yeah, really appreciate that comment. I see Stephen, you came off of mute for just a second. I didn't know if you wanted to make a comment here. I've sent you a request to unmute. Stephen, you there?
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, no, I was just coming from the breakout session 1.
Oh, okay. Would you like to add anything to the discussion here?
Not at the moment, just because I'm not really sure where you guys are in the discussion, so I don't feel useful. Thank you.
No, totally. Totally fine. I see Marco back, which probably means that we're about at time for this breakout session, and there's plenty more people who are seem to be hopping on. So Marco, should we maybe give a minute or two more to the other breakout sessions before we choose to end, or is everybody kind of hopping back on now?
Our group came to a natural stopping point, so we're done. But yeah, maybe a minute or two for the rest to let them close up their conversations would be good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, please, I don't want to have to resort to the Ferris Bueller method, but don't think I won't. So to sort of I guess recap a little bit. There's been mentions of of other markets too that could increase this value stack in terms of potentially distribution level demand flexibility. That's being potentially considered by the CPUC right now. And also the mention of FERC order, is it 2x4 or 4x2? I don't remember. What they call it.
2222.
2222. Talking about coordination between wholesale and distribution levels to set priorities and have folks not necessarily participate in the bulk market when there's a distribution resilience need. So just for folks that have just joined, does anybody want to sort of talk a little bit about where they see whether this sort of affected what we were talking about in the first part of the breakout session with prioritization methodologies. I do feel like the teacher in Ferris Bueller taking role. Bueller. Well, perhaps I'll do what I did in the last session and just kind of throw out what's on my mind, and feel free to raise your hand and tell me I'm completely off base or wrong or what have you. I think I would personally be more inclined to balance resources more towards the resiliency needs, especially in the face of looking at the outage data, that there are these multi-day outages, both at a small at a small scale, isolated scale, but also at sort of a an area wide scale. And I think seeing that would certainly be much more of a deterrent from balancing systems more towards market participation rather than towards resilience at that level. And especially with what we discussed in Sonora about how how there's a fairly high number of medical, sort of critical medical customers that we want to that we're talking about. I think again it's important to protect those most vulnerable to these sort of long outages. So I would consider and again, this would have to be a very data-driven approach, but I would certainly consider reserving 40, 50, maybe even 60% of any sort of storage capacities to sort of have an ability to ride out these outages in order to protect these folks. And Larissa made a very good point that a lot of commercial and industrial customers are sort of thinking about their own resilience needs, so it may be less of a it may be less of an issue that they are sort of taking into account their own resilience. But there could be potential beneficial overlaps between the customer categories depending on siting. So just my 2 cents. If anybody wants to chime in, and like I said, tell me I'm completely wrong. Feel free.
Don't forget mobility. That you can use mobile resources here that might supplement and enhance your stationary solutions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I'm curious if anybody wants to add to that. Bueller? Bueller? I know I keep making that joke, but I genuinely do feel like that. Okay, so sort of not seeing any other hands, perhaps this would be the time I can maybe just hop over to the other breakout sessions real quick, just to kind of see where folks are with those, and then I'll come back here and we can potentially end the breakout sessions and reconvene. How does that sound? Okay, I have told folks to start wrapping up, so we'll give them maybe a minute or two more, and then we can end the breakout sessions and hop back. Oop. Looks like someone's hopped onto the breakout sessions panel, and it's probably going to end said breakout sessions. Much appreciated. Okay, I have ended the breakout session, so everybody should be back in the main webinar in just a moment, and then we can get rolling again. Great, and with that, I think everybody's back to the main webinar. So thanks everyone. Thanks everyone. I heard some pretty awesome participation in the couple of breakout sessions that I happened to hop over to give the warning. So let's go ahead and go around the horn real quick from the moderators for each of the breakout sessions, just to kind of summarize what you've heard. So Jason, you're first on my screen. So go ahead.
You picked on me twice, right, to go first, Julian? Let's see if I can summarize in real time here. All right, so we started by first identifying, which community, just broadly speaking, has the most severe outage problem, and why do we think that? I think there were comments that Sonora seems on its face to be experiencing the most severe outage problems because it has multi-day outages. It has more medical residential customers and a higher score on Cal Enviro screen. Someone pointed out that there are more DERs in Sonora, so we need to unpack that. What's going on there, and whether the DERs are actually doing some sort of behind-the-scenes contributing to relieving sort of outage potential from those areas. But there's a general point that we would need to get down to the community specific community details to understand what the community needs were. And oftentimes the communities are best positioned to identify what their needs are. There are very there are unique factors to consider. It's not just a matter of like counting, for example, critical facilities. What are the types of critical facilities, and where if there is an outage in for one community, are there relatively like closely situated other critical facilities that may be accessible to so the customers in the area. Someone made a point that and this is a related point, that the type of DER that's installed and whether it has sectionalized capabilities if disconnected from the grid, that matters as well, because not all DER capacity can be counted in the same way all the time. Let's see, moving on down, when we're discussing, what are some, apart from needing to know the unique characteristics of each community, what are some general factors that we can consider? And someone raised the point of, we can apply the principle of focusing on lower income disadvantaged communities first, like as sort of a guiding principle, because those are the people for whom a value of a dollar can go the furthest. But a counterpoint to that is, well, so income is one factor of determining need, but obviously so is outage frequency, duration, and this just gets into this really difficult question of how do we trade off investments in different communities that have, let's say a community has a greater need, but the solutions to address their need are way more expensive, right? And let's and taking income into account makes it even, I think, a trickier question. It's very situationally specific. Once you know the kind of outage that you're trying to mitigate, then you can really better determine what the solution will be. And then so it's important to consider that when you've decided on a solution, and let's say you've even implemented a resiliency solution, unless there are specific, let's say, criteria or requirements that solution is in fact contributing resiliency during the time of need, it will be hard to guarantee that it's actually serving that purpose. So this gets to the point of like needing standards and sort of resiliency sort of requirements to making sure that once an investment is made, that it is actually targeting the problem that it was chosen to address. So I've been talking, it feels like, for a little while, so I want to hand it off to the next breakout session moderator.
All right, next person on my screen is Owner. Go ahead.
So me, okay. Yeah, thanks, Julian. So yeah, I mean, a lot of really good points made. So I'll try to kind of distill and summarize, but just might be missing a few of those. So in terms of, I think from the outage characteristics, the starting point was Twin Heart has higher outages. So if you didn't know anything else, it makes sense to start there, but very quickly kind of come down to like, well, the characteristics, the community characteristics behind the characteristics of the infrastructure that's there is a big factor. So heard that, for example, high DR penetration at Sonora. I think to the same point that you made, Jason, it might be a relief, and it might create a better baseline to bring the resilience up to whatever might be needed. Like, so an incremental, like say, investments for a microgrid or other types of like resilient solutions, because there's more distributed generation to begin with, it might be easier to implement there. So that might bring the net cost down. So that was one point we made. Also, just like Sonora having 10 circuits versus Twin Heart has, having only 2, that might also have some implications in terms of like incremental investments to bring resilience. It might be, in a place with 2 circuits, it might just cost less to add like a community microgrid or similar solutions. But then one thing that one point that was made related to that was that if one of the circuits are down, then it might just create some kind of vulnerabilities to just relying on just the other circuit. But yeah, so let me see, just looking at my notes. I think when we look at, one kind of common theme, and just heard it, is that the amount of information that we have is a good starting point, but we need a lot more information about understanding the really community characteristics and what's really essential, which customers are really vulnerable versus not. So for example, if some of the houses are secondary houses, like some of that residential load is load, on vacation homes, for example, then, those customers might, not be there, or if they're there, they might have other options if a resilience event happens. So like that, in terms of kind of like that relates to, I think, the baseline assessment in the 4 pillars, that, having other options if the hazard happens is a big factor that's highlighted. In terms of distributed generators, I think a point made was also like whether there's any other like distributed generation. It might be diesel. It's not ideal, but if some customers have diesel generators, it may not be solar plus storage. It may not necessarily support the future like clean energy goals, but having some kind of backup generator by the customers would be a factor to consider when deciding between the communities to invest. And then I think in terms of the outage characteristics, one of the participants highlighted that it makes a huge difference whether this event is whether an outage event is a multi-day outage versus a short duration outage, because if it's a weather, cold snap or a heat wave, it's one thing to just deal with it for a couple of hours versus multiple days in a row. It's just like so I think it's something to really prioritize over like short duration outages. Where locational differences can matter too. Like if the heat wave is happening and you're at a location where you're already at 120 degrees, really impactful versus another location where you're not really exposed to that level of heat. Or the same thing can go for the cold events, cold snaps as well. In terms of the value stacking, are we talking about that one too, or yeah? So in terms of the value stacking, I think the idea is generally like supported from what I heard, but one comment we had was some kind of caution against these resources are behind the meter resources, and monetization of that value may not always be as straightforward. There's some challenges of getting that value, that might be avoided cost that we've summarized in our graphics, getting that value passed to customers through direct customer participation, has some challenges that have been highlighted, or whether it's through retail rates. I mean, they're equally important challenges there. So I think it's just kind of a cautiously optimistic, just comment there that it's something to that's important. That just because they're avoided costs does not necessarily give the customer the incentives to operate it in a certain way, because they may not see those benefits. They may not even have the incentive to operate it in that way to really realize those benefits. But yeah, I think that was just of it.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Owner. We'll throw it over to Marco.
Thank you. So in my room, I had 4 people. Again, it was a great discussion, really thoughtful comments. Everyone seemed to agree just at first that longer duration outages, those are the big concern. We did a lot of compare and contrast about the challenges for 2 types of customers. One is the disabled and medically vulnerable people, and then the other is C&I customers. So the disabled and medically vulnerable people, they typically have some short-term mitigations in place for shorter-term outages, but longer duration is a huge problem for them. There are not many other things that they can do to help with that. C&I, they're more likely to have invested in a resilience solution themselves. And also just in general, it's easier to quantify the financial impacts of that on them. Compared to residential customers. One person felt that Sonora might be the bigger problem just because it's more people and likely fewer resources available in an emergency per person. Another felt there were probably good opportunities to invest in both communities. And more generally, for broader sets of customers, just the consideration that outages result in lost wages for everyone. And that a resilient solution might have the side benefit of taking the pressure out of emergency services as a benefit to all, which is consistent with risk management framework. And then after some discussion, we talked about frequency. So frequency could be a problem. For medically vulnerable, number one, it's the long duration, but if they get frequent outages, that could also be problematic. And then for C&I, depending on the business, they might be sensitive to shutdown startup costs. If they have those, that could be a problem. The economics was a tougher question. So for some, there was one comment that the on-site resilience value, it might justify the investment by itself, especially if what you're investing is a diesel generator, which is relatively cheap. So the ability to value stack could help to get them off of diesel. And then that could have that side benefit to the community of reducing pollution. And then towards something Jason said, someone also mentioned that the solution, it's just going to be really specific. I guess you said this too, Owner, that it's going to be really specific to the infrastructure of that community. So it does have to be assessed more bottom up. That's how I interpreted that.
Great, thanks, Marco. And I will close out this roundup. I had the main room. I think there were anywhere between sort of 10 or 12 folks on there. Truthfully, not a ton of discussion. I did a lot of talking on those sessions, but thank you to the folks that did participate and didn't make me sit there and go Bueller for a full hour. The discussion we had was mostly focused on some sort of other considerations for value stacking, and there was a mention for ongoing proceedings of the CPUC regarding demand flexibility. When looking at sort of a retail market at the distribution level, for compensation for that kind of demand flexibility, and then that could be another source of revenue to sort of stack value on top of the other very enumerated value streams that are being done. There was also talk about FERC Order 2222, talking about sort of coordination between the wholesale and distribution levels to set priorities so that, when there is a resilience need at the distribution level, you're not sort of obligated to participate at the bulk power level. Another interesting thought was sort of mobility of resources. Can we sort of supplement and enhance our stationary solutions? be that batteries, maybe fuel cells, solar, with these kind of mobile solutions that can kind of deliver resiliency to where it was needed. I think there was a lot of agreement. We sort of continued the discussion from I think our the first part in talking about there was a sort of heavy focus on equity, and looking at these incredibly vulnerable customers that are incredibly vulnerable to power outages in the sort of residential medical category. And especially in Sonora, and kind of seeing how impacted they are and how disproportionately impacted they are because of the fact that they are reliant on electricity for those medical devices. So I think we were sort of all in agreement that there was that there should be a more equity focused look at how we prioritize these resources sort of between the two spaces. So I think that about summarizes what we were talking about there. So Marco, Owner, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Okay, yeah. So I think these are really helpful comments, and just kind of like to tie it, we have a little more kind of discussion on the value stacking and prioritization, and a few examples at the end, kind of like illustrate with all the limitations that we've discussed, like how things can play out, and what grid benefit stacking might do to this optimal solutions, basically. So we discussed the considerations for value stacking in our prior workshop, but just kind of reiterating here for illustration, like the top chart here is just showing a stylized version of 3 types of risks over the course of a year. If you just have the renewable curtailment system reliability risks that are faced by the bulk grid, compared to like wildfire and PSPS risks faced by the customers and the communities. And if those are the kind of the key risks that are kind of prioritized across, you can kind of see that the profiles overlap, but they're not fully coincident. So that might be some rooms for changing the priorities throughout the course of the year. So renewable curtailment risk is highest in spring. When solar output is highest and electric demand is still relatively low. At the system level, you have renewable oversupply challenges and curtailments. And then the system reliability, resource adequacy risk, today, tends to be highest in summer, although going forward, this might start to shift or expand with the electrification, including electrification of some heating load. And then at the customer level, when you look at the wildfire risk, the risk tends to start in summer, but it peaks in fall, where the wind speeds are really the highest, driving the wildfire risks to a different level, a higher level. And then if you just were to compare like 3 different use cases, the bars at the bottom correspond to 3 separate use cases. You can kind of start with like a baseline of prioritizing resilience and resilience only, and always keeping a resource on standby. So in this case, there's no value stacking. But then, in the middle bar, you can recognize that the main risk, resilience risk due to wildfires is minimal during the first half of the year. So, it recognizes that and offers the resource capacity to the grid to help with renewable integration. And then the bottom bar extends the duration of grid services to also cover summer months during which system reliability needs are the highest. So like each case here reflects a different level of resilience from customers' perspective and a different net cost. And of course, there's an open question about like how much of those benefits can really be monetized by the customers. I mean, there are a lot of kind of challenges, barriers that needs to be still addressed. But in terms of comparing kind of and prioritizing, there's no kind of answer that would be applicable to everyone. It would be really prudent to evaluate these trade-offs carefully and determine which use case really best fits the customer's needs and their risk preferences. So, the optimal solution might be different for different types of customers located at different places, even if the risk profiles are symmetric. Just the vulnerability levels and what's essential load versus not would make a huge difference. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is an example, kind of building on what we've discussed during the breakout session. We compare alternative solutions at those two locations that we've picked for the group exercises. And we consider, just for illustration purposes, consider wires and non-wire solutions, and assume that non-wires alternatives are more expensive, but it has the option to reduce net cost by offering grid services. And again, just solely illustrative purposes, just for discussion. This is not meant to provide any kind of specific recommendations for these specific communities that we're really illustrating here. So just kind of like looking at the table closely, like at Sonora, we have a wire solution at an assumed cost level of 1x. And then you assume that non-wires alternatives cost 3 times that if you just install it and use it only for resilience. But if you prioritize grid services, say for May through August, just offer that capacity just for those months, the net cost would come down by half. So it would be 1.5x. But of course, like those 3 months, it would also expose the customer to potential resilience and outage events. So at the end, the outage mitigation level drops to 80%. So operating and prioritizing that way doesn't give you the near full protection that you would have if you just prioritize resilience. So like at Sonora, like the non-wires alternative here, it's more expensive, still more expensive than the wire solution, 1.5x versus 1x. And the outage mitigation is lower, 80% versus almost 100%. So if within that construct, it suggests that the wire solution here would be the obvious choice. But if you go to Twin Heart, the picture can be very different. So assume that because of the location, say the wire solution is more difficult to implement there, and just bringing up the cost level to 2x, so much higher than what you see in Sonora. And there, if you look at the non-wires alternative for full protection, it's still more expensive at 3x. But with value stacking, if you can bring the net cost down to 1.5x, that might be something worth considering. And then also the outage mitigation here drops to only 95%. Unlike in Sonora, where it drops to 80%. It drops more in Sonora because if you remember in Sonora during the summer period, there are more outages. Throughout the year, including in summer. So if you just prioritize grid services in the middle of summer, it reduces the protection more in Sonora than in Twin Heart. So looking at this picture now, the choice is a lot less clear, because would you pay 2x for 100% mitigation or 1.5x for 95% mitigation? It's just like it's a trade-off that needs to be really considered and analyzed carefully. So let's with that just move to the next slide, please. And then the second example, it builds on the prior example and focusing on refining the priorities and use cases for value stack. So here the top 2 rows, A and B, are from the previous example in Twin Heart. So if you don't have any grid services, just prioritizing resilience results in 100% mitigation with a cost level of 3x. And then offering capacity to grid in May through August would reduce the mitigation to 95% and offsets net cost by 50%. But then, starting the grid services, so going to use case C, starting the grid services a little bit earlier in March rather than May, it can further reduce the mitigation. So it would reduce the mitigation to 80%, but it can increase the cost offset from 50% to 60%. And then extending grid services even more under use case D to also offer capacity in September and December. It reduces cost offsets drastically to 80% because the grid benefit, the potential grid benefits, if monetized, if it can be monetized, the potential grid benefits are really high in those months. But at the same time, like you see the mitigation levels dropping significantly because of the increased overlap between PSPS outage risks and those high grid value periods. So again, like across those cases, there is no one size fits all solution. The optimal solution, the optimal choice would really depend on the characteristics of the customers affected and their unique risk profiles. So for example, if a customer or community with lots of critical load at risk, you can look at this picture and say, I'm not willing to take any risk. I'll go with A and accept the high cost. But then another customer or a community with more discretionary load and less critical load might prefer, say, use case C instead, and willing to take some residual risk in exchange for major cost reductions. So, and again, I mean, this is just for discussion purposes, just to highlight the importance of making analyzing those trade-offs and making it as transparent, and then a need for bringing the community characteristics and the risk preferences into the decision making at the end, because there are a lot of moving pieces, and depending on how you cut it and how you look at it, you might get a different answer. But I think that was it. So I don't know if how we're doing on time. We can take some more Q&As, or we can just I'll pass it to Mariko to jump to the next part if we're running behind schedule.
How are we looking on time? Because there are a couple of questions and comments in the Q&A, but we can also save them. We can also save them to the end if we need to just bomb on through.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just go through the next 3 slides. I'll go through them relatively quickly, and then we'll get to I do see there are a couple of questions up. Thanks for your patience. So we've been alluding to our resilience evaluation model being stochastic. So I have these 3 last slides to give you a better sense of the purpose of that architecture. Just like resource adequacy and IRP, a resilience investment, whether that's specific resource or portfolio, it functions kind of like insurance. We don't know exactly when or where a resilience event will happen, but when it does happen, we want the resource to be there ready. So to understand resilience value, it's not enough to see how it performs in a single grid simulation, a single model run, or a single representation of grid conditions in the planning year. And to even understand when a resource needs to be ready and available, we first need to observe in our baseline assessment, what are the possibilities in terms of how hazards and failure points can translate into outages. So what we can do with a stochastic model is we can run many different versions of the planning year in our baseline assessment to get a feel for the range and distribution of possible outage outcomes. So we can start with our weather variants, we can carry those through to how they impact demand and supply, and we can include other stochastic variables for forced outages and derates with layers for those for both blue sky conditions and then more extreme conditions. So let's say we end up with our stochastic model with thousands of different versions of what outages could look like in a planning year. First, I want to say we're not trying to plan for every single future, every single type of outage and situation. If you think back on our detailed outage table, by prioritizing the types of outages you're most concerned about, by looking at that range of outage outcomes and situations from the stochastic model, we think it'd be possible from there instead to narrow down to the most concerning outcomes from a resilience planning situation, and then refine your view on the magnitude and time profile of your resilience risks. So by doing that, you're sorting out your runs to untangle what's high priority versus low priority, and you're also starting to untangle reliability from resilience. So once you do that, you can get a better sense of what resource attributes you need, what you're looking for a solution, and then start exploring, well, if I build this thing for resilience, would it be possible to layer on services to the grid at times when I know my resilience risk is low? So this is an illustration of what it would mean to prioritize and reweight outage results in a stochastic model when you've got like thousands of variants on your planning year. So let's say you have outage outcomes for your planning year. You've got so thousands of those like results tables we showed you earlier. That's represented in the left chart. Each run can be summarized as total unserved energy or loss of load in kilowatt hour terms in the planning year, and that's shown on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, this is a frequency distribution, so it shows you how many of the runs that you have that quantity of loss of load. So if you look down the middle, there's your loss of load expectation, or LOLI. So let's say you've looked at the detailed outage results table and you've decided that your community has zero tolerance for multi-day outages for residential customers. So that's your top planning priority, is to reduce that. And what we've got here is, let's say all of the pink highlighted bars, those contain those runs of concern. Those contain those outage results that have multi-day outages for residential customers. And they sometimes show up in years where outages overall are not that big of a deal, and sometimes when they're more extreme. If you're to go back to the table and give all your multi-day outages for residential customers a weighting or a multiplier to represent that prioritization that you have, then you can start to move your runs of concern to the right of the distribution, to the more extreme end, as you see on the graph on the right. So these are no longer in natural kilowatt hour units. They're now weighted kilowatt hours. But now the distribution better reflects your risk tolerances. So from here, you can then pick a subset of runs on the tail. Let's say you've picked all the runs in the 90th to 90th percentile in terms of your total weighted loss of load, and you can focus on that subset of runs in your resilience planning. When you subset the runs this way, this is where you really have to think about that reliability versus resilience risk separation. When does the situation elevate out of a reliability problem and into a resilience problem? And by inspecting the runs that you get, you can start to get a feel for that. So let's say you pull out one of your 90th percentile runs and you compare it to an 85th percentile run. Does the 85th percentile run look like an outcome on outages that might be included already in a reliability analysis? Or is it looking like something more extreme that might not be included in a reliability analysis? With that, you can start to really refine your threshold for what is already counted in reliability versus resilience. And the other thing you can do once you figure out those thresholds and you figure out the subset of runs that you're most concerned about, you want to focus on for resilience planning, you can then go back and get a better picture on what are the hazards and failure points really driving those specific outcomes. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank you all for your time. In a minute or two, we're going to turn to the commissioner for closing remarks. I think we can fit in a couple of Q&A. But before we do that, on behalf of myself and owner, I want to thank the commissioner and the CPUC's amazing microgrids and resilience team for hosting us today. To you in the audience, thank you for being here, and thank you for all the dialogue and discussion. If you'd like to fill out our post-workshop survey, we have a link here on our last slide, number 55. You can tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see in future workshops. We have another one coming up in November. And if you want to learn more about our study, please visit lumenenergystrategy.com/resilience. And with that, I will turn it over to Julian for any final Q&A, and then we'll turn to the commissioner.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Marco. It looks like we have a few questions within the Q&A bracket that I'll go ahead and ask out loud. Joel asks, earlier in the deck, supply chain risk was highlighted as a major resilience concern. How does this factor into the value stack opportunities charted here? That is there a place where the speed to operations and mitigation of supply chain risk on the grid is well valued?
That's a question. I mean, that's tricky. I mean, I can definitely see being an issue. Like, I mean, value. I mean, there's been a lot of supply chain risks, for bringing the grid scale resources online, in especially through the pandemic and all the supply chain interruptions. Bringing the resources online. I mean, so far what I've seen is that there's been tremendous amount of effort to really kind of make that happen. But I think in the process, what happens is that the cushion needed to meet the reliability needs is increased to account for that. So if there's a resource and that can reliably bring resources online while providing resilience, I can see that potentially being tapped into, but it would be challenging to really monetize it, I think, unless it's just kind of it's a factor that where the resources demonstrated that it's not really affected by those kind of supply chain risks, the same supply chain risks that are applicable to some grid scale resources. It would be challenging to really monetize, but I don't know. Want to add anything to it?
Great, thanks, Odin. The next question from Peter Clower. Was analysis done to determine that capacity was available May through August? And I assume this is in relation to the breakout exercise that we did.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the time profile of the capacity value, so we used the loss of load analysis that was done as a part of the IRP process, and just basically estimated that the highest value would be kind of more towards kind of the summer period, peaking in like August and September. And then in terms of just whether the capacity is available, it really is going to be a function of whether the priorities are set such that the resource capacity is offered into either the market or recognized by the utilities in response to their retail rates, and shown that it's basically providing capacity. We haven't done any further analysis to really demonstrate if capacity is available or not, but we think that if for example, if those are like, say, microgrid or behind the meter solar plus storage, and if it's not kept on standby for resilience, in say May through August, if the resources are offered into the market, say through CAISO's PDR participation model, up to a certain level, up to the load reductions that they can provide, they can get capacity credits. Of course, I mean, it's subject to some verification and validation that these capacity reductions are actually provided, but it is certainly feasible to tap into that value stream to that. I don't know if Peter, that answered your question. If you have any follow-ups, I'd love to hear.
Okay, not seeing a hand raised, so maybe this will be the last one. This is a bit more of a comment that it is a question, but it ended up in the Q&A. From Patrick McCoy, who says, it seems to me that cost offset by grid services needs more information in order to be credible. What is the cost being offset? What are the grid services being provided? And what are the available options for grid planners / operators that could be utilized for these grid services? So I'll let you all react to that one. And I do see we have one hand as well.
Do you want me to? Yeah, I can take it. Yeah, I mean, the cost being offset is the cost of the resilient solution. And it can be a wire solution, non-wire solution. I don't want to be kind of prescriptive about the resource itself, because I think the approach, the framework here is can be technology agnostic. But the offset is the cost of that resilience mitigation solution. The services that are being provided, I mean, it really depends on the circumstances. But if you can either as a kind of on the supply side by participating in the CAISO market, or as a load modifying resource responding to retail rates, you can just basically provide energy and provide capacity to some degree. You can just operate in a way that mitigates the renewable curtailment challenges that this system is experiencing. And then those are just a few, I think, that we've kind of illustrated in our example, but I'm sure there are other benefits that can be tapped into. It's a challenge. I'm not saying today all of those value streams are accessible without any kind of any barriers, but to the extent that there's that societal benefit that exists, that there are a lot of opportunities for providing those kind of benefits and reduce the cost of resilience mitigation.
Fantastic. I see we do have a couple of hands raised as well. Let's just do these, and then I think after that we'll close out. We'll close out. So the first hand I see raised is Jeremy. Please go ahead and state your name and your affiliation when you ask your question or make your comment, just so we know who this is. Jeremy, I have requested that you unmute.
Not to belabor this point, but I've heard it come up several times, and I just want to reiterate. Sorry, Jeremy Donnell with PG&E. The availability of revenue sources such as RA, et cetera, is extremely suspect. When you think about it, the way a DER developer would go about citing a project is to figure out where they can build it at lowest cost and be able to earn revenue. When you're talking about a microgrid, you're saying, where do I have a resilience need? Okay, I'm going to put a DER there, and it's like throwing a dart at the dartboard and hoping to hit bullseye when it comes to getting RA value. Most of the projects that we've seen pop up, they're in areas that are constrained, and we just don't feel like RA is a realistic opportunity, which is one of the biggest revenue sources. And so I know this is just kind of like a high level analysis, but and it sounds like others in this workshop just want to make sure that as we're going through this, we're not having an inappropriately rosy assumption about the availability of revenue sources. There are some out there, but they're pretty limited and very situationally specific, as Owner just said.
Great, very much appreciate that. Appreciate that, Jeremy. Owner Marco, do you have any reaction to that, or should we move on to the next hand?
I mean, I would generally agree. I mean, we've done a comprehensive storage study for the CPUC, looking at the historical operations of all sorts of storage resources, including the grid scale, participating in the bulk grid and the market versus behind the meter distributed storage, either distribution connected or customer sided. We see a lot of challenges for distributed resources kind of tapping into resource adequacy value. I mean, and we discussed that at length. So yeah, I mean, our intention is not to really paint any kind of rosy picture that all of these are just illustrative examples with some real data behind it. And it should be taken as kind of potential benefits and cost offsets. And what we really wanted to really discuss here is, if those value streams are there, how would you think about it? Because you have to have the answer to that. Because if you wait until all the kind of the market barriers or retail reforms are done before you ask that question, it will be too late. I think the discussion of how to prioritize resilience and grid services needs to be done today in parallel with all those kind of market reforms and retail reforms that are being pursued today.
Great, thanks, Owner. And final hand of the day is, and after this, we'll go to our sort of outro. Ben Schwartz, again, please do state your name and your affiliation before you ask your question and make your comment. Ben, you're unmuted.
Great, thanks. Ben Schwartz from the Clean Coalition here. I just want to quickly bring up, in relation to what Jeremy and others have said about grid services, the fact that many combinations of grid services and resilient solutions that may be difficult to currently pair will be potentially enabled by distribution system operator framework, as well as more flexible or concrete legal agreements with the utilities. Included in that is the concept of a greater amount of distribution deferral than what currently exists, as well as having community microgrids that are capable of islanding during normal blue sky conditions to reduce load overall and benefit the grid, while ensuring that a resilient state of charge remains for the microgrid. And then just finally, on a separate subject, I would like to bring up a question that Kristen Rounds, sorry, I believe from the Public Advocate's Office, brought up just about the procedure between this working group and the proceeding. And I don't have her question up exactly, but she essentially said, since resilience has been scoped out of the proceeding, what will the relationship be between the development of this framework and something that is approved by the proceeding? In the proceeding, sorry. Thank you.
So perhaps I'll answer the procedural question first, and then turn it over to Mark and Owner for any further follow-ups. Yeah, that is correct. As of right now, the resilience question is not scoped into the microgrids proceeding per the latest scoping memo. You know, we don't. There has been no action related to that. You know, passed through the commission right now. And, you know, I have to offer the standard disclaimer that I do not speak for the commission, the commission, but, you know, keep your eyes out for you know, procedural uses of this. For now, we will be continuing the workshop and informational session series that we have set out to do to further explore this topic and to further sort of figure out where we can go with this. But for right now, that is correct, that it is not currently scoped into a proceeding. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark and Owner to answer any questions.
I think Owner answered it all.
No, but I mean, I think so. I remember seeing that question from Kristen. I think you just answered. Maybe for the broad audience to kind of reiterate your answer here.
My answer?
Yeah, Kristen. Like about the procedure. Let me just go find it.
Yeah, all I said was my response, written response was that I can't answer the procedural questions, but in terms of our model and our intention for how that model would sort of interface with IRP and grid planning processes, our intention is to make them available and as transparent as possible to support those existing processes and models.
Fantastic. Well, looking at the time, it's about 10 after, so perhaps I will now pass it to Commissioner Shiroma for closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Julian and everyone, Mariko, Owner, Roseanne, and all participants who took several hours out of your time today to spend with us. I found the questions, the discussion, the brainstorming just really helpful. I think that you know, as we are weighing a definition, as far as prioritizations and so forth, it's been important to keep in mind our environmental social justice action plan and our quest for equity, realizing that even if we were to treat all efforts with equity, there are communities that have fallen far below others in terms of access to resources and in terms of the experience in California from an energy perspective. So today's workshop discussion, that was very insightful. Look forward to continuing that. I'm very grateful to have Lumen's wisdom here and knowledge, the sophistication that's geared towards the modeling. And in terms of a home for this effort, you know, I refer to slide 16, Lumen's slide 16, where it really shows that, you know, we've been talking about microgrids for some time, but in and around all that, there is also the climate adaptation proceeding. There's the wildfire mitigation efforts. There's the risk assessment mitigation phase of general rate cases. There's the integrated resource plan. There's the Energy Commission's IPER forecast, and on and on. So just realizing that this is a larger effort, and we will navigate where the home is, realizing that that resiliency impacts many of our efforts at the CPUC and also at the Energy Commission. So thank you, everybody. Look forward to the next workshop, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Shiroma. Marco, if you want to skip down to the end. Just to sort of close out here, today's workshop was pointed out right here with a nice big red arrow and red text. Our next workshop will be held on October 19th, where we will be having San Diego Gas and Electric and Sonoma County Junior College District present some use cases for the four pillar methodology. We're very excited about that workshop and what they're going to bring to the table in relation to this methodology that we created. So we highly encourage you to come join that informational session to further share your perspectives on the issue. Next slide, please. And with that, we want to really thank first Lumen Energy Strategies, both Marco and owner, for bringing such incredible perspective to us in this session. Big thank you to Commissioner Shiroma for her sort of oversight and opinion on all of this. Big thank you to Roseanne Rakevich, who did so much work to help organize this workshop, and Jason for the sage guidance in how we're putting this together. For more information, please feel free to email either myself or Roseanne. Our emails are shown here on the screen. And as I said, the recording and the workshop materials will be posted to the website shown here, the Resiliency and Microgrids website at the CPUC. With that, I want to thank everybody for attending and sharing their perspective, and I want to wish everybody a fantastic afternoon. Take care, y'all.